And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from tonight already. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Miss Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's been a kind of a wild ride for a week.
This is the new normal. It's wild every week.
Is that astrology or something? Because
yes.
First of all, we have the Biden, regime announcing a special prosecutor against Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And all those deadly documents, although the DOJ announced, I guess there were no nuclear documents in there after all. Well, that leaves the UFO file and the JFK assassination file. So we had that going on. And then on the Republican side, what did they decide to do? Hey, we're going to investigate Biden and his skeezy son. So the battle is on.
Mm-hmm.
The battle's engaged, as they say. And people over on Twitter, there's been a lot of wild stuff on Twitter too, and Musk leadership was very rocky his first go round. But today he announced, I'm going to let Jordan Peterson back on. Well, that's nice. I'll let a respected psychiatrist back on. That makes sense. What about Peter McCullough? But no Alex Jones. No on the Alex Jones. And so a lot of people were looking at that and just saying, free speech is for everybody, even speech you don't like, right? You don't have to like Alex, as it were. But I think it is important that, and Elon's response to that was like, well, tough, So when we look at that, I think we have to see beyond the whole facade. The guy who supposedly can get to Mars can't even stand up to the liberal lynch mob. And those aren't even liberals, of course. They're willing to lynch liberals, as we know. And this is the nature. I mean, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, who is the focus of tonight's X series episode 140, is somebody that they wouldn't recognize as a liberal at all. They would probably call him a arc right conservative at this point.
You think so?
Yes. Oh yeah, tax cutting, and he would never go for all these labels or the clamp down on free speech or lockdowns or any of that stuff. The Kennedys were all about freedom after all. And I think it is fascinating, though, when we think of the shift in that party and how they go after their own members. As a matter of fact, if a formerly good reporter like a Glenn Greenwald type guy who was like good on the left, and he writes a book now, the left will never have him if he writes a book. If he writes something about Epstein or somebody, forget it. It's over. So how far? What is it that's gone in the place of the left then? What's there? What is this thing that's there now? And it's hard because we all have different political identifications, whatever it happens to be, but ultimately when you see a dramatic shift like that, all those Democrats are left out in the cold because this thing has just moved out and the neocons have taken over. And they want war, baby, and they're going to give it to you. And they'll give it to you overseas. They almost gave us World War III this week with the Ukraine scare and the Zelensky saying, it's a Russian missile, defend me with a nuke. And then it turned out, hey, no, it was a Ukraine missile that launched into Poland. Those are the types of things, exactly the types of things that you run the risk of when you engage in a war. And that whole situation. Immediately in the wake of that, the Biden administration asked for another $37 billion for Mr. Zelensky, comedian Zelensky. So, that's our money. And if we don't want it going there, then we have to make a really loud noise about it not going there. And there are those channels available to us, and I'm doing it right here. And I suggest we all do it because that situation is not only a black hole of money, but it is seriously dangerous. And what they need is to invest that $37 billion into a peace process and have a real diplomatic goal as far as this goes, because the neocons just scooping up money for Lockheed Martin is a terrible formula for this country and for other countries. And we just don't need it, and that's one of the things I think that Republican Congress could do to show, hey, we're in and we're new and we're different. A lot of interesting things there as well. Just to kind of wrap this up a little bit around the political situation is the Carrie Lake loss, supposedly, to Katie Hobbs. Katie Hobbs, who has no personality and no policies and wouldn't debate, but she's somehow bested Carrie Lake in Arizona, where everybody
You forgot, oversaw the election, the count.
Yes.
Right.
Well, she oversaw the Senate election,
Mhm.
which she should have recused herself as Secretary of State. But I mean, we're seeing a lot of that, and it reminds you, you get those little bells in your ear about Stepford Biden winning, and you're like, wait a minute, isn't this guy who was like standing on crates at drive-ins? You know, so you saw all these Trump rallies with hundreds of thousands of people, and then you saw this one guy like, you know, screwing up his lines, and even Obama couldn't save him. And then somehow we're expected to believe that was an 81 million vote getter. So, you know, you're going to have to fix that situation, and it's got to be state by state. And the best way to do it is through paper ballots. There's no question about it, but it's going to become crucial because here we go again. It is like deja vu. It's like The Strange Life of Ivan Osikin. From last week, we did the Mystery School episode on eternal recurrence. And so many of you enjoyed that. We're going to get more into that as we go forward. And we have some exciting shows coming up. Tonight's I'm particularly excited about. We have some incredible things to put across as far as the anniversary of John F. Kennedy. And this is the 59th anniversary of the assassination that we're looking at here coming up on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, we'll be running some programming, documentaries and things related directly to this. But tonight's show is going to be important because it's the real hardcore focus on the JFK assassination and the UFO file. And this is something that is so crucial to American history and world history, and is still not very well understood. You know, you still have the general thing of, oh, Oswald did it, you know, and that whole thing is the stage norm. And when they want to kind of come in and do the limited hangout, they'll say like, well, there could have been a Cuban or a mafia guy involved, you know, and now they have good people going back to this mafia thing. It's very easy when we look at the JFK assassination, which was a horrible tragedy. You know, to try to blame it on a group like the mafia doesn't make any sense, because the mafia, you know, couldn't destroy the autopsy records. You know, the mafia couldn't get the media to not cover it. The mafia couldn't do all these things that required a deep state apparatus, which took control on that day in November 22nd, 1963. So we have to look at it through the lens of those stories that they've given us, because there's intrigue involved, but these are low-level, B-level players. And what we want is the main team and the main players, the main group. And the group that I've referred to as X-Protect on this program is deeply involved with aerospace secrets in the UFO file, are the ones who pulled off the assassination, and they represent a branch of the Central Intelligence Agency working with the defense contractors. And on the aerospace side, in the military-industrial complex, interestingly enough, this was the conclusion that Jim Garrison, the DA from New Orleans, came to. So we're going to get into that tonight, and I'm going to reveal some connections and combinations of things here on this. I want to remind you that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's broadcast, and Miss Olivia is putting those together even as we speak. You can ask them now, and
in all caps, please.
In all caps, exactly, because there's just so many people whipping through that chat at this point. But the ideas room is looking steady and strong. I'm looking forward to your questions on this tonight, and some real hardcore, interesting players, and some things that you haven't heard, some real breakthroughs on this. So we're going to get into it. It's great to have so many of you here with us. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. Redcap Goblin wanted to know any updates on box A17.
Well, A17 is a reference that came up in the Ghislaine Maxwell interview that happened over a year ago. And then it was also one of the boxes that was grabbed at Mar-a-Lago. I continue to look for some interesting crisscross information on that, but it seems to me that the two are related, and that the original video that we did on it stands. I think that there are interesting things going on in relation to the Ghislaine Maxwell case, and including the fact that charges were being dropped by Virginia Giuffre against Alan Dershowitz. I think that these are some of the moves that we're seeing in relation to that case, and that case, and in particular, the information that came forward in the testimony by Giuffre against Prince Andrew, we got Alexandra Cousteau being a target. We got Marvin Minsky. These things have opened up dramatically the case for the hot zone, and her using Janet Atlantis, as we've suggested in several episodes on Ghislaine in the hot zone and the Epstein work around Atlantis. There's a big piece there. We're continuing to work on it. You're going to see more in relation to the hot zone and Epstein, because now they're intrinsically, it's a whole modern wave of it. And we're lucky because, Ernest Hemingway comes up tonight, believe it or not, in relation to this JFK story. And he is a main kind of toehold into the strangeness around the hot zone and the entire Atlantis search that was going on, and the links for those hot zone groups that are connected all the way from T.T. Brown, Ernest Hemingway, and John F. Kennedy, the kind of ex-share group, as I've referred to them. This whole piece gets a tremendous boost from Giuffre's testimony, because one of the things she put on the record was about Alexandra Cousteau, who his grandfather went all over the world searching for Atlantis. That key information they wanted. And this is a major clue to the Belial cult aspect involving there. So you're going to see a lot more from us on that for sure. And with that, Miss Olivia,
we could just go straight into questions. Everybody is so knowledgeable who has been following the show for a while. Tina Borch says, a few years ago, I looked at the unclassified FBI files and ran across a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, and he said Lee Harvey Oswald was one of his best field agents. Any comments?
Well, in all of my investigating around Hoover, I've never seen that. So, Hoover is not likely to admit it under any circumstances. So my guess is that the document would be a forgery of some kind. But I will tell you this, that J. Edgar Hoover, in fact, did report on Lee Harvey Oswald, and he reported on him 3 years before the assassination. In fact, he put it on the record. The director of the FBI observed about the lowly Oswald, who was in the Soviet Union at the time, also quite dramatic for a 20-year-old who, was only making minimum wage and didn't go to college and all these things. The way they portray Oswald as this ultimate loser is very interesting, because, in fact, he had such a high security clearance that when he was working at Tsugi, he got to work on the same track as the CIA U-2 team. And so they were using him for intelligence purposes very early on, and that story is going to stand out tonight. But how interesting is it that before we have the assassination of the president 3 years later, that the head, not a field agent, not a supervisor, not even an assistant director, the actual director commenting in his own hand on the person who will be accused as the assassin 3 years later in the JFK assassination. That's incredible enough. There are all kinds of links in relation to the FBI and the CIA with Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald worked as both an undercover asset for the FBI and for a very unusual group called DISC, which is Defense and Intelligence Security Command. And this has to be brought into the picture because we get the foundations around X-Protect. We get close to that X-Protect piece. And X-Protect, we can understand, is the group that controls the UFO file and will use all means necessary. So they will discredit people who get too close to the truth. They will spin stories, and in very extreme cases, they will go to lethal means. And, we have all kinds of cases of that, from Morris Jessup back in the 50s all the way up to much more modern cases. And JFK himself falls right into the CIA X-Protect bullseye on this, because the moves that he's making in terms of world change affect directly what the United States regarded as the highest level of security that they had for anything, and that was the UFO file. And it still is. And the continuity of government program comes up tonight, and it's crucial. And it comes in through the 7 Days in May movie and novel that Kennedy was so enchanted by that he allowed them to shoot. He allowed John Frankenheimer, the director, who would also shoot The Manchurian Candidate, which is about a presidential assassination. And he allowed them to use the White House. And he said, people need to see this and get behind it. If you study, and it's starting to become apparent when there's a crisscross between deep state researchers and UFO researchers. It's rare because the deep state researchers are so hardcore in relation to solid work, and the UFO team has kind of gone off the reservation, and they've been working with CIA people and being like, the CIA is going to give us disclosure and TTSA and all that stuff, which we've been reporting on, and they've been electing intelligence people like Elizondo and Nolan and all that. This is very important because this is a gigantic loop, and it runs from 1963 directly to 2022 here. That's a 59-year loop, and we're still stuck in it. And the great mass, as it were, is not aware of the incredible role that this advanced technology plays. We're going to get to that tonight. And also the incredible advent of the JFK presidency, which there was nothing like it at the time. And we look at the ripples that have occurred. One of the things that Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union, said about Kennedy was that he was so advanced that, and he said this in 2012, he said we were still catching up with his vision for freedom in the world. And he made that speech at the Texas School Book Depository. Now, that's one heck of a place to make a speech. If you want to say something about a president, you're directly going to where he was assassinated from, supposedly. So I think that was a very clear message from Gorbachev. That building has a very interesting history, and we're going to get into that tonight. And I guarantee you, there's so much mind-blowing information. I'm going to start off, Miss Olivia, with the TKO.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right. So back in the day when they first accused Oswald of the assassination, they came out with that picture of him in the backyard, and he was holding a rifle and a pistol. And in some pictures, he had a communist magazine, a rifle, and the pistol. So it's like this maniac, he'd kill anybody. So photo experts began to look at this picture very early on and say, well, something's wrong. Nowadays we'd look at it and just be like, it's Photoshopped. But, there were always excuses about it. Well, it looks that way because of this and all these different reasons. But anyway, they ran that on the cover of Life magazine. And in the public's mind, after Oswald had been eliminated, that pretty much, was like, oh, well, this maniac with his rifles and all that. I'm going to show you that picture and something very strange that came out about it. This is the picture. Supposedly, he's holding a communist newspaper. And he's got the rifle here. And there's a lot of weird things about this picture anyway, the way it's posed and a lot of the physical characteristics. But as it turned out, there was a policeman who was there in Dallas who had also gone to the same unit of the military as Oswald and knew him. And his name was Roscoe White. Roscoe White's very important because in 1990, Ricky White, his son, and his wife found kind of a treasure trove of things that he had put aside and he had hidden in one of their properties. And it was kind of like a collection of things, diaries and things like that. One of the things that was in there was this. And, it's like an early prototype for what they were going to make with this. They were figuring out, how can we do this? And then the people who were involved in that photo aspect around this particular picture, who were analyzing it, started to realize that Roscoe White was the model. He was the face that they were dubbing in instead of Oswald. So what they did was they took the picture of Roscoe White with the rifle in the newspaper, and then they just painted in Oswald's face. That showed up. So this was kind of presenting a problem, but something else came to pass in that. And he did kind of a resemblance to Oswald in that he had thinning hair and things of this nature. That is Roscoe White. Now, here's a few things that Ricky White and his mom put on the record. Ricky White said that he found a diary of his dad, who was a Dallas cop who was serving during the assassination. And this story got so booted off the headlines in a hurry. And I spoke to Jim Mars about it back in 2015, and the late Jim Mars. And he told me, there was no reason for the media to treat Ricky White the way that they did. But anyway, they were like, oh, disparaging, this guy's in it for a book, all that kind of stuff. And he did have the wrong people around him. There's no question. However, the whole family were aware of Roscoe White and his weird connection to the whole underworld piece and Jack Ruby and the rest of it. So it was worth taking a listen to. There were a couple of key things that came up in Roscoe White's diary that Ricky White brought to the fore. And I'm going to grab a couple of those to get us off and running here tonight. Okay, first of all, Ricky White, Roscoe's son, says the FBI took the diary. So he said he gave it to them, and he had to recall it later from memory. The journal was an interesting mix of the familiar, the convenient. It must have read like a C-grade movie script, and yet it was a scenario that nearly every critic of the Warren Commission wanted to believe. This is a Texas journal, so they have a slant that is against the whole story, and yet there's some key information in here. As Ricky recalls, the entry for November 22nd, 1963 started like this. Quote, this is Roscoe White writing now, I was Mandarin, the man behind the stockade fence who fired 2 shots. Lebanon was the man in the book depository who fired 2 shots. Saul was the man in the records building who fired 2 shots. Oswald wasn't mentioned here by name. That's the end of the quote. Mandarin's spot behind the stockade fence, the crest of the grassy knoll, would have been the perfect position for a sniper. From that vantage point, a marksman could have picked off the president with a pistol. And then, the whole bit about the Warren Commission says this. And the Warren Commission, as we know, was the presidential commission that LBJ put together and put Allen Dulles in charge of, so that none of the secrets of intelligence and how the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in assassinating President Kennedy would ever get out. Now, what's interesting is that Geneva was Roscoe White's wife, and she was ill at the time, but she was still able to give some kind of key information, and she backed up her son. So count on this. And here's what she had to say. Geneva recalls being introduced to Lee Oswald a few months before the assassination at a rifle range near Grand Prairie Naval Air Station, where White and Oswald were practicing marksmanship. A few weeks later, she saw Oswald in a grocery store near his home, near their home in Oak Cliff. I saw your friend Lee today, she told Roscoe, who became irritated and told her to never mention the name again. About that time, Geneva caught her husband, who was having an extramarital affair with this woman named Hazel. And this goes on and on. But anyway, as a result of this, there's a whole relationship that comes in about Jack Ruby, and she finds out that her husband has been working with this strip club owner. Jack Ruby's mention of Hazel's name one night at the Carousel Club, she stopped outside the door and the office and eavesdropped. She heard Ruby tell her husband, Hazel is the contact. Ruby said something about the Bay of Pigs and how Kennedy had betrayed them. The longer she listened, Geneva said, the clearer it became to her that her husband and Ruby were talking about killing the president, this at least in the memory of a dying woman. So the wife has these kind of weird interaction with her husband. Now, Roscoe White dies in a very suspicious explosion in 1975. Anyone around the Kennedy case, who had significant information, the odds were that they were eliminated. And at a certain point, when they were making the movie Executive Action, which also comes up tonight, they enlisted an actuary to do the odds and what would happen, with all these people who were related and witnesses for the Warren Commission, for them to die under these mysterious circumstances. And the odds came back 100,000 trillion to 1. So, the karate chops, the getting mistaken for a deer, all these things that would happen to these people were part of a coordinated program to get rid of them. It was a death list. Now, anyone who could back up this version of events that was not the official version. Now, there were waves of these witness eliminations. The Warren Commission represented one version of this, and there was a huge wave there in the 60s. But in the 70s, when there was another wave, you might say that in the 60s, with the original Kennedy case, it's like they were fooling our grandparents. But by the time our parents got involved, in the 70s and 80s and looking at this case and piecing it apart, they had to stop it again. And so when you get the House Assassination Committee investigating this on a congressional level in the late 70s, you start seeing all this wave of witness deaths again. And then one more time in the 90s, when we have the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, they come in and they say the same thing. We've got to get these records out. The JFK movie kicks this off. And what happens? There's another weird wave of deaths involved. So there's something about the Kennedy assassination that goes to the heart, the foundation of the deep state control over the world and this country. And so what we need to do is realize on a level that, we've been dealing with this story so much that so much of the old story that they fooled our ancestors with, and things like the magic bullet and stuff like that are now kind of a punchline, right, in cultural history. So we understand that it's a fraud, but then what really happened and what was behind it? And what they want to do, I think, at this point, and we see movies coming out and things like that, they're willing to go in and say, well, the mafia did it. And we already know that that's a ridiculous explanation, especially since, the CIA controls the mafia and hires them for different things. So certainly in relation to this, the CIA would be the top suspect, not the handguns that they were using. So we need to go deeper when we look at the Kennedy case and say, what was the problem? What were they trying to get rid of in relation to Kennedy? And it wasn't just, this guy is independent and we need to kind of get rid of him. It was, he represents a threat on such a level that they needed to step in with a deep event using some of their most secret channels, including the continuity of government doomsday network communication piece, which comes up in the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. Why did they take the chance to do this with Kennedy and eliminate him in this fashion? And this becomes so crucial. And what was it? Why was Kennedy such a threat? Now, we have a lot of very interesting explanations that we've heard over the years, but the only one that really catches my attention on the depth and the level of needing to get rid of him applies directly to the exotic technology piece involved with the aerospace companies and the UFO file. This is such a crucial part, and there's so much evidence for it. We put some of it on the record. I'm going to try to put some more on it tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 140. We're looking at the JFK assassination, the 59th anniversary coming up on Tuesday, and the UFO file in relation to this. What is that X-Protect group doing by eliminating President Kennedy? And as Professor Peter Dale Scott put it across, this is the first deep state revolt against the White House. So why did it happen, and who are the people involved? We're going to get to it and how it echoes. That echo from Dealey Plaza comes right through to 2022 and the UFO threat op and the pieces that we've been seeing. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of all this. Miss Olivia, before I go any further, it's up to you.
Karen Carpenter, is anyone directly involved with the assassination still alive today?
Directly involved in the planning? No, most of them are dead. And, it's funny because when you look at the reasons why the CIA was saying, well, we need to hold off on releasing those records, is they said what you said, which is, hey, there's people who are still alive that are involved here. No, these people have been dead for a long time. Can you imagine an average agent of that period, say around 30 to 35 years old? And so it's 1963. So they're basically born in 1930. So that would put them in the kind of place between 30 and 50, somewhere between 92 and 112. So your odds are, things are are certainly, they're either preparing to be dead or most of those agents are dead. The other piece that we're looking at is that when you think about the Central Intelligence Agency's reasons, one of the things they say is, we don't want to reveal sources and methods. Well, if your sources and methods haven't changed in 60 years, you're in so much trouble anyway, forget about it. And then the other thing is, in terms of countries, well, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore, right? You still have Russia, of course, to deal with. In Cuba, there's no more Castro, so all these things, these explanations are just delay tactics to create reasons so that, the public can't find out that they're guilty. It's pretty obvious. And I think it is interesting when they say, well, we don't want to reveal any agents. They could come under, there are ways to put this information out. Those agents, one, are dead, and two, the countries don't even exist anymore. What kind of a secret could you have 60 years later that would still be so important to national security? It doesn't make sense. And unless it's related directly to this UFO program and they involve a lethal group at that level to remove their own president, then you'd find out, oh, there's a group with advanced exotic technology, and they overrule every democratic process that we have in the country. They overrule the Constitution, and they act with impunity. That's a problem. It's a very, very big problem. And but we've seen, even through the COVID op, we've seen that unconstitutional activity. And through the realm of continuity of government program, we're seeing more of this. That is what they have in store in relation to that whole UFO threat piece. And I'm going to show how that doesn't go too far tonight, because in fact, they've already given signs that this is the track that they're on. So wild speculation, 'tis not. But I will say this, that going back to the film, 7 Days in May, which came out, that Kennedy supported and that they shot in the White House, there are direct references in here to what President Kennedy was up against. And I believe that Kennedy, there's a reason why he was working closely with the director. I'm going to say why, starting with Burt Lancaster. Good old Burt.
All right.
We like Burt. He's playing General James Scott, who is the COG commander. And what he does is he puts together a base in the desert, a la Area 51, and he creates his own COG reality, and he is going to take over the country and fight the Russians. Damn it. And there he is, and right behind him are these missiles that say Lockheed on them. This is a first kind of major clue coming through this very interesting movie, which is about a coup d'etat in that period, in which President Kennedy was so enamored with and felt was so realistic for what he was dealing with these people around him who were basically from the military side, from the intelligence side, trying to get him into a nuclear war over Cuba and other reasons. When we look at some of the stills from this movie, there's something fascinating that I'm going to show you in a series of images here. And then I'm going to tell you about Base X that is referenced, which is the continuity of government base in the movie. And they call it Mount Thunder. It's actually a stand-in for Mount Weather there in Virginia. Okay, so here we have General Scott coming in to kind of get ready to put together his COG plan. And there's a map up here showing aspects of New Mexico. So over here, you have the Carlsbad Caves and so on. If we zoom in a little bit more, we're going to find something pretty interesting. Kirk Douglas pops into the frame, and he's an assistant to the president who the COG commander is going to take over control. And over here, we're getting a little more. And what it says there is Artesia, but right above it, if you take a look, it's going to say Roswell. So here we have a direct indication about Roswell and COG and the overthrow of the presidency in relation directly
That's shocking.
well, think about it. Roswell now had happened in 1947, but nobody knew anything about it. There was one major story that we knew got snuffed out, and then it wasn't rediscovered until Jesse Marcel came out in 1980 and told Stanton Friedman the whole thing. And then everybody knew about it. But between 47 and 1980, there was nothing. Now let's go a little bit deeper. There's more shots of him in that map and all the rest of it. But to get really close, let's take a look at Burt doing his able best to give us that COG vibe. Right above him, right here, is Roswell. It's clear as day. So he's referencing Roswell, New Mexico, which is understood on the inside as where they're holding the alien technology. And then we have the whole movie around the idea of the COG commander taking control and removing the president, President Lyman, who's a weak president, as the military regarded
Weak
Kennedy.
sister.
Weak sister.
Mhm.
Exactly. He refers to Base X in here as where they're launching this from. And they have a few bases. It's true. They don't only use the term Base X, but Mount Thunder becomes very important here. So people who've analyzed the book have said that Mount Thunder is Mount Weather. I'm just going to read a little bit about Mount Weather to give us some idea of the headwinds and the forces that JFK was up against with his own military, with this piece, 7 Days in May, directed by Dr. John Frankenheimer, and also written by Charles Bailey and Fletcher.
I think it's Neville.
Neville. Yeah,
Mhm.
Fletcher Neville. And the book was already successful. And so that was something that reached Kennedy. And he absolutely just was like, this is so true to life. Let me get behind this project 100%. All right. The first video of Mount Weather shot from the air to be broadcast on national TV was filmed by ABC News producer Bill Lichtenstein and was included in the 1983 2020 segment, Nuclear Preparation. Can We Survive? Featuring 2020 correspondent Tom Jarrell. Lichtenstein flew over Mount Weather facility with an ABC camera crew. The news magazine report also included House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill and Representative Ed Markey. You know, Tip O'Neill's contemplating a nuclear war will sucking down the Canadian club. There was contingency plans for the relocation of the United States government in the event of a nuclear war or a major disaster. Now, both Mount Weather and the now deactivated bunker at the Greenbrier were featured in the A&E documentary Bunkers. The documentary, first broadcast in 2001, features extensive interviews with engineers and political intelligence analysis, rare insights from secret installations. So this was the key installation that, you know, in case of a nuclear emergency or COG emergency, they were going to run things from there. Now, while the novel 7 Days in May mentions a facility called Mount Thunder, a reference to Mount Weather, the road descriptions in the book make it quite clear that it is, in fact, the same facility. It's also referred to in the movie based on the book filmed during the Kennedy administration and released in 1964. Kennedy didn't live to see the release of this or the Manchurian Candidate. As a matter of fact, Frank Sinatra bought the rights to the movie that he was in, Manchurian Candidate, and buried it for 18 years because of the assassination. And, you know, we all know that his early association with the Kennedys and then JFK saying, I don't want anything to do with them, and really giving him a cold shoulder. Frank Sinatra realizing when he was assassinated, something was up and he didn't want any part of it. And he buried this classic movie. And I remember seeing him interviewed about it. And they said, why did you bury it? You know, you have a great performance and everything else. And now that it's come out, all the critics call it a classic 18 years later. And he said, oh, yeah, I don't know what happened. Good answer, Frank.
Weird.
But it gives kind of a weird look in those old blue eyes. So we have a piece here now when we're looking at the administration giving it to us through Hollywood, that we're up against something, and it has something to do with COG, with Roswell, and with their attitude of taking over. Kennedy, of course, had to face a lot of this in his own administration. And when he came in, if you look at his notes to aides like Arthur Schlesinger and so on, he cannot believe, as well informed as he is, he cannot believe that the powers of the Central Intelligence Agency reach to the levels that they do, and that they are overthrowing countries, and that they have their own air force, and that they seem outside of the range of executive powers, and that there's no oversight on what the Central Intelligence Agency is doing. Now let's sort of walk back in history a little bit. How did we get stuck with this thing? And by the way, it's growing and growing and growing. It has showed no signs of stopping. And there are very minor attempts once in the 70s, of course, after the assassinations, to rein them in. Once more after Iran-Contra, after we found out all the funny money in the COG networks that they were using to move that money around the world to overthrow other governments. And then during the Bush era, with all the torture sites and all that stuff. And interestingly enough, Bloody Gina there, who ran the torture sites, comes back, and in the last year of Trump's presidency, she's the CIA director, and she gives him all this terrible advice, like, hey, assassinate this Iranian general. That'll make us look good in the world's eyes, and things of this nature. But that's it. In terms of turning the brakes on the CIA, it just does not happen. They've been shown to be behind drug running, assassinations, overthrow of countries, intense secrecy around the UFO file and other subjects, and barely any oversight. But their control over the media grows and grows. Their control over Hollywood grows and grows. And now they have sister agencies like Homeland Security, 250,000 employees. How could you even have 250,000 employees? Government employees for Homeland Security? They didn't even exist until the September 11th attacks. So we're in a different environment than the people who were, pre-2001. And when we look back in that era to the 90s and things like that, those people were living in a different America. This America has something called Northcom. And Northcom didn't exist before the 9/11 attacks. We used to have, Southcom and things like that to keep an eye on drug running in Central America and all things of this nature. But Northcom was never heard of. Well, this thing was invented, and, fundamentally, the rule of law in America was meant to be laid down by the police. But when you get down to it, what we have now is the structure of Northcom is that Northcom, in the advent of the continuity of government program being activated, takes over and rules with a central general, and they have regional governors until they can restore order for a new election. Yeah, good luck with that. So this is the nature of that world that Kennedy was looking at and warning about. And when he makes that great speech at American University in June of 1963, he's giving us this vision of, what is it? What kind of a world do we seek? What kind of a world are we looking for? And he said, well, it's not a Pax Americana imposed upon the world by American weapons of war. We need to re-examine our attitudes towards Russia. And then he says we need to avoid fighting a nuclear war where even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. Well, that's pretty clear. This is a very different vision. And this is someone who understands the stakes. And we have to remember about Kennedy that very often we just think of him as, this millionaire, sheltered playboy. And there's all these stories that always run in the media because of his high social life caliber and all this. But this is somebody who went to war, had his vessel attacked, swam to safety, saved his crew, had to live on an island. He saw war up front and he saw the horrors of it. And he's someone who also had faced death on a number of different occasions. And the last rites were given to him on several occasions. In fact, one time when he developed yellow fever when he was in the East, and for other medical reasons when he was growing up. So he's a very different character than the kind of, playboy that they just liked. I'm sure he had that side to him, but he had a lot more depth. When we go back and we see him beating Nixon, Nixon was the odds-on favorite in that election. So again, Kennedy pulls off a very big surprise there. And a lot of that is through his own presence and hard work, and through his television debates and really proving that he has the caliber to do this. He also overcame heavy-duty health ailments while running for president in order to put it across. And this is somebody who, had already developed a reputation in the Senate, which he joined in 1952, with his brother doing very hardcore anti-mafia and anti-crime world hearings. And so he was very savvy. He'd travel all around the world. He had grown up practically in England. I mean, he was born here, over in Brookline, but when his father, Joseph Kennedy, got the gig as the ambassador to the UK, they were over there. So he learned all about that structure. And it's a very important thing as well, because when he comes back, what he wants to do is become a journalist, in fact. And he writes a book called Why England Slept, and how all these things happened to England, and how there was the rise of Hitler, and why England did nothing about it. And so he's taking off on this journey of being a journalist, and he's writing about, all the different things he's going to do. And then his brother dies. And his brother dies during a secret mission of transferring armaments. And Joe Jr. was really the father's favorite, the apple of his eye, and he was the one he was going to put over the finish line for president. He hadn't actually thought about Jack in relation to that. So the father switches all of his own ambitions over to John. And it's interesting, too, because we have to go back a little bit with the father to get a flavor of how much the family knew about how the world operated. Because the father was already a greatly successful businessman. And by the time we get to Kennedy being in the White House, I want you to think on the level of Bill Gates' money. They had incredible money. They were some of the world's richest people, period. And so when they got in there with that kind of money and influence, this is a real big problem for the deep state and for those intelligence groups that are looking at him and saying, he's uncontrollable. And the father, the various ways that he made the money, it's very often said that he was a bootlegger and all these different things. There's a lot of unusual things that he did, including movie theaters before really anybody had them. And he was deeply, deeply vested in Hollywood, Joseph Kennedy. But mostly he was really hardcore during the period of the stock market frenzy of the 1920s. And that's where he made the family fortune. And he knew how to invest the stuff. And he also knew all the shady moves that you could do when it was non-regulated. When the stock market crash happened, and then FDR got in after the Great Depression started, then he selects Joseph Kennedy basically to clean up that whole stock market thing. And everyone says to him, why are you getting that guy? He did half of the dirty deals in the stock market. He was the most unregulated guy of the whole batch. Why would you have him in the government? And FDR said, if you want to, you definitely want the king rat if you want to control all the rats in relation to the stock market. So that's how he thought of Joe Kennedy. And he also wanted to keep an eye on him because he knew that Kennedy wanted to run for president, the father. Now, when he becomes the UK ambassador and he brings the family over there, they're very popular, etc. But then World War II starts to hit, and he's starting to look at the situation and say, Hitler's getting so big so fast, and it looks like England's going to be devastated. Maybe we should come to some kind of agreement. And so they take that as being soft on fascism, and his entire future history is gone. And he gets removed as ambassador, and the family comes back to America. And that's when he starts to live through the sons. And so by the time we get to Joe Jr. dying, then it really becomes incumbent on John to run for political office, which he does not have any interest in. Interestingly enough, with all of his world knowledge, with all his wanting to change the world, he is not interested in being a politician. And he's very book smart. He's very kind of detail oriented, and he wants to go into something else. But what happens is in 1946, at the age of 29, he will win a seat in Congress, and certainly under Joe's influence heavily, but he didn't need that much influence because he had all the kind of smarts and charisma to make it happen. And then by the time we get to 1952, he's been in Congress 6 years later. Then he takes over the Senate seat. So he's on a roll here. And the people that he meets along the way, like Nixon, gets into Congress at the same time. So they're kind of keeping an eye on each other during this period. Kennedy goes all over the world. He goes to Vietnam long before the war. And that's how he knows, because he watches the French are already in there and they're having tremendous problems. And he's like, we're never going to bury America in Vietnam trying to get involved in their civil war. Forget it. And so Kennedy has this kind of incredible vision that he develops by these world travels. And little by little, his image is gathering steam. And in 1956, he's selected. A lot of people are pushing him to be the VP candidate for Adlai Stevenson. And Stevenson goes down really hard against Eisenhower. And so it's very lucky that, as it turned out, Kennedy didn't have enough votes to become Stevenson's VP. And he's all depressed about it. And he calls his dad and says, oh, I lost. I didn't get on the ticket. And Joseph Kennedy said, this is a huge relief because Adlai Stevenson is the biggest loser. And as it turns out, Stevenson lost twice to Eisenhower. It's like, complete throwdown. But by the time you get to 1960, there are incredible tensions in the world. There are revolutions breaking out. And we have atomic issues about, the Soviet Union has developed the atomic bomb. And so there are all these questions going on. And so a lot of the questions are, can Kennedy, at the age of 41, get in there and do this? And so he's looking at, getting in there and running for office. And he decides that he's going to do it. And the entire Democratic establishment, including Eleanor Roosevelt and all these others, are completely against him. And Harry Truman, everybody. It's just like, forget about that boy, and a lot of them want Stevenson again. So what's weird is that Stevenson, represents this kind of like idealism that they had, like, oh, we'll build a family of nations, but he doesn't have any leadership abilities. And so interestingly enough, Kennedy does make him ambassador to the UN. So he finds his true role in life as it goes. But JFK, when he's coming into office, the Central Intelligence Agency is having problems even before he gets across the finish line. And what they do is they profile him before he becomes president, which is a rare move. And interestingly enough, there's a book about this where they cover the fact that this type of activity is not something that you see. And I'm going to give you the title of the book before we're done today. But they profiled him and they figured out we need to kind of guide him, and maybe, he's going to be open to advice if he sees reliable authorities. So they start kind of sending people to him and giving him intel and things of this nature. But when he starts to really become a major challenge to Nixon, they are disappointed because they are going to build the New World Order with Nixon. And Nixon was ready for it. And Nixon was in the palm of Howard Hughes. And long story short, on Howard Hughes, basically, he's giving tremendous amounts of money to Nixon's brother to create fast food chains all over the West Coast. And what he wants is, Hughes is already becoming a solid entity with the Central Intelligence Agency. They are starting to use his incredible finances to launch attacks against Cuba and things of this nature. And they're training people and they're using his land and things like this. So that's such a close relationship. But in the back of it, there's Hughes Aerospace. And Hughes Aerospace is a core piece of how we get into trouble around the Kennedy, Nixon, and then the assassinations in the middle. Because Hughes Aerospace is one very committed to redeveloping that UFO file and becoming the main contractor along with Boeing and Lockheed for this aerospace piece. And they are going to incorporate this X technology. And the Kennedys and Howard Hughes have a very, they understand the things that Hughes has done for Nixon, and they think of him as a very dirty player. So there's no love going on there to start with. And the Kennedys also disapprove of the fact that Hughes has funded and helped and worked with the CIA in overthrowing these governments and doing all these covert activities. So by the time you're getting to 1960, you've got the clash of the Central Intelligence Agency backed Hughes group and candidate Nixon against Kennedy, who comes in independent, wins over his own establishment of the Democratic Party, and becomes, the main leading candidate for this role. And what happens in the middle of it is it's such a tight fight because the country has become so used to Nixon and Eisenhower and the safe 50s thing that Kennedy in his talk sounds almost radical in a way. But he wins them over and shows that he's not just like a hot-headed young guy who comes from this wealthy family. And also the fact that he's a Catholic becomes a major issue. So we're looking at something dramatic there with Kennedy. He comes in, and with all the money and all the, deals that they make to get into power, they barely get by the machine of Hughes and Nixon and the CIA. It's like that close. And
well, you can say it.
What?
They cheated.
Oh, well,
it's
they all,
acknowledged.
the Nixon Kennedy election is one of the first elections where it became very obvious to the public that everybody was pulling strings somewhere. But, and they had been, going up to that point too. That was the first election. It was just like in everybody's face. And I do think it's important, though, when Kennedy comes in, he comes in with that vision. And just by making that race as close as it was, showed what a fantastic candidate he was. And then to win against, using their own tricks against the Nixon CIA tricks, somehow they pull it off. And, there are mafia deals on both sides and all the rest of it. And it's a very complex situation. That's why it's so funny when they got to the 2020 election and they were like, you can't ever say that elections aren't legit. Look at the 2000 election. Hello, 300 votes that somebody found in Florida. I mean, come on. And little did we know that Pat Buchanan ended up swaying that entire vote. So you see, if you get one guy that runs as an independent, he can control the whole world. Remember that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight on the Kennedy presidency and why he was selected by the deep state to be removed and the horrible assassination that followed that changed the world and set our future on a very beleaguered path. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of this episode. And also, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for a newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us in touch through all the incredible suppression that we've been seeing of censorship and getting these ideas across. I was thinking of that Elon piece from earlier and how he was sort of touting that, hey, look, I've let so-and-so out of Twitter jail. And the kind of craziness of this period and how we're going to look back on it and say these idiots, who wanted to pretend that the technology somehow gave them the wisdom and the right to control the human race and things like free speech, which are guaranteed in the Constitution, by the way. And that's another thing. I want to invite all these tech leaders from Google to Facebook and Twitter. I will read you the Constitution, and we'll do a whole show of it where I'll just read the Constitution to you because you don't understand what the Constitution is. And that's a big problem. And I'm not sure if that's because, you're coming in from other countries and ruling the technology. You come into America and you're like, these countries don't have the Constitution, so we don't need to use that Constitution in America. America is run by the Constitution, and free speech is central in that Constitution, along with a lot of other rights that you're willing to infringe. So these guys who are coming in and being like, well, if we regarded speech that, it doesn't fit in, then it's out, and I'm talking about normal speech where people question things like medical treatments, etc. These are the things that we've seen, and we're in deep, deep trouble if we can't have that conversation. And I know they like to pretend on a certain level, well, you have these shows out there where we pay this guy $300 million to talk about issues that are important like this. That's not the same thing, because as soon as you accept $300 million from somebody, you're beholden to what they want to do. And now here's this guy, he's the richest man in the world. And supposedly he says, I want to change things up here. And you know what? Those woke investors that are part of this whole change and reset, and are involved on the World Economic Forum level with narrowing the conversation. You know, it's just like in 1984 where they were trying to eliminate words that people could think in. You know, when he gets into that position, and if he has to say, well, I'm powerless because they'll take away my ad revenue, then what kind of a future are you going to have? That requires strength on the part of a leader. And it has to be, in that case, a tech leader, a corporate leader, and the political leaders. This is just the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. It's a crucial period. The Kennedy assassination is going to give us some of the hints of that bravery that took place, and also some of the cost that's involved when you take a truly brave stand. Before I jump into part 2, Miss Olivia.
Mr. Wonderful, is Donald Sutherland's Mr. X character in the JFK movie based on an actual person?
Yes, it's Fletcher Prouty, and Colonel Fletcher Prouty was the liaison between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA from 1955 to 1964. And he comes up tonight because at the end of his life, he wrote a book in the 70s called The Secret Team that was all about the JFK assassination. And he gave us so many key points, but he was giving Garrison information, and the foundation of the Mr. X character in the JFK assassination is Fletcher Prouty. Prouty, in the second version of The Secret Team, has something very interesting to say about aliens. And this is interesting too, because he says all along they've needed an enemy to build up that war machine in the military industrial complex. Now they're preparing UFOs for that role. That's Prouty on the record in the intro to his own book in 1997. So don't tell me they haven't been planning this UFO threat. There's the man on the inside who understood how they were working and what their timelines were all about. So he'd seen it from the Kennedy assassination and, you know, the threat of nuclear war, seriously, the Vietnam War, you know, flight madness, destroying countries, you know, all the people who came back damaged mentally and physically from that war, all the families and the ripples and all the rest of it. He'd been through it all. So we've seen that what he was saying there is coming from a very educated place. So when we think about Prouty saying that, then we really know that we're in the era of the UFO threat. And this is a piece, again, that comes in directly with the Kennedy assassination, because there's a deep UFO exotic technology aspect involved in the background of President Kennedy. And it goes right into his presidency and cuts to the core of his battle with the Central Intelligence Agency. Wasn't the only issue, but it was the key one. We're going to go into why here. As I mentioned, okay, so I'm going to basically go another half hour and then we'll take questions. How's that?
Sure.
Fantastic. How you doing out there?
You want another question? Brian D wants to know, wasn't it Eisenhower that had Area 51 surrounded by military because they wouldn't let him in?
Yes. There's a couple of sources for that story. What's interesting about that is if you look enough through those details, you'll find out that there were 2 blue books, and that the blue book they were giving us was the phony, like, oh, it was just a bird, it wasn't a UFO. And that whole thing, which even J. Allen Hynek, who ran it, was like, oh, I'm out of here. This is ridiculous. And they had him saying ridiculous things like swamp gas. But there was another blue book. There was CIA blue book, the real program, the actual program. And the person that Eisenhower put in charge of CIA blue book was President Nixon, who was vice president then. So that's why when Nixon, you know, goes into this whole period of fighting Kennedy and then develops his own presidency and then gets thrown out unceremoniously, there's a big, huge UFO trail right after Nixon as well. And there are all kinds of UFO stories related to Nixon. And, you know, so when you get back there and you look in the 50s and see him in charge of UFO Blue Book, then it's a little bit different. And because that's where the key stuff was being studied. And the Project Blue Book was literally to put the public to sleep. Now, you can say for one reason or another, you know, they wanted to do that, well, because we'd been through World War II. And after all, you know, world-weary nation. I don't believe any of the excuses around it. You know, I don't think it was for any of those reasons. I think it was because it was such an obvious advantage for the groups that could take this information and study it. And the more that they learned about it, the more powerful that they became. I think that that becomes very obvious. And they didn't want the plebes on the same level as they were. That's a lot better explanation than they were considering, you know, that the world had been through wars and things like that. All right. Let's do a little bit of a piece here around the UFO file and then lead it into the assassination. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 140, the JFK assassination and the UFO file. Here comes the UFO file. Do you recognize this guy? That's John Trump. John Trump is working on unusual technology, MIT, over here at MIT. It's about 8 minutes away from here. And he's working under Vannevar Bush. In fact, Vannevar Bush is, you know, his protege is John Trump. John Trump will, as part of Vannevar Bush's group, become part of the secrecy corps that gets developed. One, to fight World War II, but two, to study very unusual technology. What we know is that Vannevar Bush was directly in charge of the UFO file. He was the top scientist and trusted because he came out of that whole Masonic secrecy piece, and in fact was the Grand Master of the MIT Grand Lodge of Masons. Now, a few things about Vannevar Bush. One is that he is the one who is responsible whenever there are things being raised after World War II about Nazi scientists coming over here through paperclip. He's the one who's throwing his weight around and saying, we can't get X, 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 and X accomplished unless you guys give us this scientist, that scientist. So he, every time you look at, if you go back to the original book about Project Paperclip, I always have a copy of it close by. I'll show it before we're done here. But what's interesting is if you go through the early activities of Vannevar Bush, you're going to find him over and over again in this role of objecting. Now, he's the one who formulates so much of the paperclip response, and Truman himself objects quite a bit to us having those Nazi scientists. Now, I want to get this piece on the record, which is any nation would have taken, you know, the country that they had conquered and used their best scientific minds. That part is not so very surprising. The problem is that the people involved maintained this kind of martial philosophy. And so they brought that into the programs over to the United States. By the way, you know, the Russians also got a fair amount of Nazi scientists. It just seems like we got the cream of the crop, but we also got a great deal of that ideology mixed in with this. And this becomes a problem by the time you get to the Kennedy version of going into space peacefully and exploring space with our partners, the Soviet Union and all the rest. This is anathema to those Nazis who fought and killed 20 million or 25 million Russians. So, you know, for them, Kennedy looks like the ultimate threat. You're going to find this term national security threat applied to Kennedy in the background. This is how the Central Intelligence Agency and X-Protect is activated, because they're able to say Kennedy is a threat to the country, just like the general, the COG general in 7 Days in May. He's saying President Lyman is a threat, therefore I have the moral right to take over. So this gets into very dicey territory, but let's think of it this way. From the OSS through the CIA, through the Office of Policy Coordination, which after all was the wildest branch of covert activity, and even Truman and the government said we have to get that OPC thing under control, Frank Wisner and all those people, let's bring them under the umbrella of the CIA, which was basically analytical groups. That group instantly came in and converted the CIA into this covert powerhouse. A few things we have to remember about the Central Intelligence Agency. One, it's founded from a different principle than you might think. Whereas military intelligence comes from a certain place, the Central Intelligence Agency was born at S&C, which is Sullivan and Cromwell, in a law firm. And in that law firm was Allen Dulles. So, there's all these things. As I said, we took on the paperclip program, and we took on those Nazi scientists and their philosophy in intelligence, of course, through General Galen and the early development of the Central Intelligence Agency. We took that on. But what is it that S&C was dealing with? It was dealing with international finance. So when you get to that level of interaction on this, you have to understand that the CIA is representing those interests internationally. And so one of the ways we can imagine this is, there's a group like Exxon that wants to have oil fields in Uzbekistan. And they say, you know what, it would be great, but the only problem is if there's ever a revolution in Uzbekistan, they'll seize the oil fields. Then what? So they have to make up a political situation, and the conduit for that is the Central Intelligence Agency. They go over there, they overthrow the government of Uzbekistan, and they put in a puppet who's going to be friendly to Exxon so that they're going to be able to do this. That's kind of a simplification of how this process works. And so the Central Intelligence Agency becomes that arm for international finance and business inside the government. The problem is that once they have these abilities and covert abilities, that they start to become literally a separate government. This is where the continuity of government piece comes in. The continuity piece is a secret group devised under Truman and Eisenhower to survive a nuclear war. Makes perfect sense. And it was a good idea at the time. The problem is it becomes so secret, and they say, well, we can't let those nuclear secrets out. After all, now we have nuclear Russia. And at first we were omnipotent. We were the only ones with the bomb. And then that whole thing gets traded out. So they decide to adopt this incredible secrecy plans about the ability to continue the government in the event of a nuclear war. Those plans in that secret government grow too strong and too secret. And so now we have the CIA element, we have the COG element, and then we have this level kind of regular public society going around on top with regular laws and rules and everything else. So by the time you get to something like the UFO file, the level of secrecy, this was stated in 1950 to Wilbur Smith, who's a Canadian who came over here and was working with the physicists here. And they had the back and forth. And physicist Sarbarker in 1950 told him, look, the UFO file is the top secret security program of the United States, higher than the atomic bomb. So the piece that was coming out of the UFO development, I've referred to it as a apotheme because it has this quality, which is that, anything goes as far as the physics is concerned. And we've heard about this. I always cite things along the lines of UFO abduction. And when you hear about UFO abduction, people say, oh, I was abducted through a wall, and we hear about blackouts, and we hear about when these things land, nothing ever grows, where that is. That's all this apotheme effect that they have been studying behind the scenes about how these things operate. Well, that isn't exclusive to the UFO file. That X technology has a big piece of this as well. And the X technology basically is something inherited. And, we can get a taste of it maybe by studying Tesla, for example, and understanding that as X technology in the UFO file. So the X technology resides in the UFO file. We'll put it that way. So now when we get into serious cases like the Roswell case and other things along this line, we have to understand that the people who are involved in those cases, Roswell, etc., in fact, a young congressman got briefed on the Roswell incident, and his name was John F. Kennedy. He was one of the few senators who got briefed about this incident that had happened. He was also somebody who was very close to the first defense secretary of the United States, James Forrestal, who was also a Catholic, and the families were close. And what did Forrestal do before Kennedy's political career took off? He grabbed him and he took him over to post-war Berlin and said, explore these ruins. And there's a fascinating story by journalist Kennedy writing about seeing these incredible scenes and how none of the Russians believed that Hitler was dead at all. They thought that was a dummy story and they didn't buy it. But very interesting things that he writes in relation to it. So Kennedy's going in to the presidency with the background. And he's already starting to understand this piece. And he understands, oh, you know, we're dealing with the UFO file. When he sits down and has that conversation with Eisenhower, one of the things that we can see in Eisenhower's response on his way out in 1961 is this incredible takedown of the military-industrial complex. He's scared for where the future is headed. And this is somebody who's seen World War II, Hitler, the Cold War, and everything else. He's afraid, and what he mentions with the most intensity is our own military-industrial complex. This is the great threat. And when he's talking to Kennedy, he, the thing that he can't say on network TV must go like something like, hey, you know, incidentally, in relation to that UFO file, they've taken it out of presidential control. You've got to get it back. So this is where Kennedy's selections for people in his cabinet and who he decides to get rid of, including Allen Dulles, becomes so very important. So let's put it this way. Fundamentally, Kennedy understood the UFO file going in. And so this isn't going to be, you know, the key for him is how do I get it back under executive control? And there's some very interesting visits that he will make over the course of his presidency that give us some idea of this is exactly what he's doing. I want to flash forward to a couple of unusual resistance points that Kennedy ran into, which are reflected directly in the incident of his assassination. And they're not often brought up, but I think that they're crucial because the location of where Kennedy was assassinated gives us a great deal of information about who was behind it and how the group that is operating around the exotic technology, the X-Protect group, is involved. So first of all, one of the things that came out, you know, St. John Hunt had this wonderful series of interviews with his dad before he died, and his dad was E. Howard Hunt. Now, E. Howard Hunt was deeply involved in the JFK assassination. He was the top CIA chief. He was not the director, but he was their top man on the ground. And the CIA had decided on this X-Protect branch to eliminate Kennedy, and the UFO file being the big piece that kind of was the final straw. And I'm going to get into that. There's a lot of reasons, and that this had been building since he got in, probably even before he got in, frankly. So there's an interesting picture called the Mary Mormon picture. One of the things that E. Howard Hunt drew for his son, St. John Hunt, was a map of where the people were that were doing the shooting. And one of the things that he wrote was French gunman Grassy Knoll. Now, there's been talk for many years about this Lucien Sarti, who was a very reckless assassin who was eventually killed in a gunfight in 1974. But there were a lot of things that came out that the Sarti was involved and that he was dressed as a policeman. So that piece about Roscoe White and how they had found this diary and that he was co-locating with these other people, the idea that the assassins were dressed as policemen makes a lot of sense. Let's see if we can do anything with this picture. This is a picture of the background of the Mary Mormon photograph. And what it shows after it's been enhanced and magnified is it shows someone here that they call Badge Man, who is there firing. And in front of him is this figure. Well, this is a construction worker that's behind him. And then there's a figure over here. Interestingly enough, the figure over here turned out to be a witness to the assassination named Gordon Arnold. And his testimony has popped up over the years a few times, but he was standing there just taking pictures. And he had been warned off the area previously by people saying, "Oh, I'm with Secret Service, get off of this fence," or whatever. So he goes to the front of the fence and he hears a bullet over his ear as Kennedy is crossing that mark, which puts him in direct target frame for the shot from the grassy knoll. And there we see someone back there firing something dressed as a cop. Now, the building where they will accuse Oswald of shooting from, the Texas School Book Depository, as I mentioned when we started, has a pretty unusual history. One of the people that's not talked about enough in relation to this, that's sort of the classic shot of Hunt, by the way, who, by the way, said that the CIA participated in the assassination, but that it was at the behest of LBJ. I actually think it worked more that the CIA with the X-Protect group set it up and LBJ went, was definitely all in. Because one of the things that's not talked about a lot either is also that LBJ, when that limousine takes that big turn onto Elm Street near the Texas School Book Depository, his future is not going to be with the Kennedy administration. Nixon has already said that they're going to replace him for 64. And there's already testimony about LBJ going down because of his relationship to the Bobby Brown scandal. And also what's interesting is Billy Celestes is another figure in all this. He's someone else who was a major piece of the LBJ machine in Texas, and how he controlled the Senate as Senate Majority Leader. He's going to prison. So suddenly it's looking like all these people and all these scandals are around Johnson, and the Kennedys want nothing to do with it. And Kennedy JFK privately says to his secretary, Evelyn, as she said later, we're going to dump LBJ from the ticket, and it's going to be the governor from North Carolina that we're going to add. So LBJ was out. So therefore, his association and the fact that he would join in with this CIA assassination makes a tremendous amount of sense. And there's a lot of evidence to support it. When I hear stories that LBJ did it on his own, there's no way that it's going to be LBJ on his own. It has to be that national security state apparatus coming into full swing and him being used as their replacement. One of the interesting people who owned the Texas School Book Depository is a guy named D.H. Byrd. D.H. Byrd is crucial for a few reasons. One, he started the Civil Air Patrol, which gets us to Lee Harvey Oswald. Two, he was an oil guy who was connected with LBJ. And three, his cousin was Admiral Byrd. Now, Admiral Byrd named a mountain in Antarctica for his cousin, D.H. Byrd. Now, here's a shot of D.H. Byrd before he sold the Texas School Book Depository, imitating Oswald's stance, firing out the window.
Whoa.
Now, interestingly enough, he would take one of the window frames, not the one supposedly that was the sniper's nest, but the one close by, and he would have it removed from the building and hung in his own living room. So when he started the Civil Air Patrol, he basically had under him David Ferrie, who was a CIA pilot. Ferrie had a lot of unusual pieces. He's depicted in the JFK movie, and they kind of capture a lot of the unusualness of the whole thing. But if you go into Ferrie, there's a lot of weird things there too, like voodoo and mystical stuff. There's also the fact that he pretended to be a priest and was associated with all these different churches, and also the fact that he was thrown out of American Airlines for basically having, this hitting on these younger men. And this whole bit, we start to get a sense of the character of the people that are being used around all of this. Now, Oswald, in the Civil Air Patrol that D.H. Byrd created, he is in David Ferrie's unit. That's Oswald at 15. So here's the direct link to how they recruited Oswald for intelligence that young. Now, Oswald also, even though he had a mom and a brother, grew up predominantly in an orphanage. So he was sort of groomed as somebody, when you look at the different records of Oswald, and some people have done some excellent tracking on this, you're going to find Oswald growing up in New York. Well, he's growing up in New Orleans. Well, he's growing up in Texas. Well, some people swear that they grew up right beside him in North Dakota. This is a person who had a doppelganger very early on, and they needed to kind of build him in this fashion. Now, later, when the Kennedy assassination takes place and Jim Garrison is hunting down all these people, he finds out that Ferrie was the Civil Air Patrol commander for Oswald, and he goes to hunt him down, and of course Ferrie is found dead shortly after that. And what we lose there is important, because we lose the direct link of how Oswald got involved with the CIA. But, well, we find other pieces of it. Here's Oswald again. This is Oswald's ID, where he is called Alec James Heidel. This was the name that the CIA gave him, and the program that he was involved in was tracking arms. This is interesting. This is something that Peter Dill Scott discovered, that he was working on this idea. They gave him a project which said, how do people get mail order rifles and things like that? I'll tell you what, we're going to give you a separate identity, Alec James Heidel, and we're going to have you order some rifles to send to a P.O. box. And, we'll see how this company in Chicago sends you these rifles, and we'll be able to track the serial numbers and all this stuff. So he's ordering weapons as a result of this CIA task. That's how he ends up. They're like, oh, look, he's using a phony name and ordering weapons, when you can walk into any store in Texas and just buy a weapon. If he was going to assassinate somebody, he'd do it that way. He wouldn't do it with this trail to a P.O. box that he checks. So they're starting to build this story of this guy. And if you look at Oswald in the summer before the assassination, you see all the threads that you need to find out exactly how they're going to position him as the patsy. One of them is to have him go on TV and defend Marxist principles. Well, one of the things we pointed out in this show is that his boss in the summer of 1963 is Guy Bannister, who was ultra hard right wing private agency. This is a guy who used to be the chief detective at the FBI station in Chicago. And then he was very early on the one who developed the X-Files for the UFO file. And he would be the guy that would show up in all these stories tracking the UFOs going to these different locations. And he even got interviewed during one of these periods. So they have pictures of him in this newspaper story from 1947. That's early, folks. Very, very early on the UFO file. So we have Lee Harvey Oswald working for Guy Bannister, who is an FBI guy, hard right-winger, and what else? The guy who got the X-Files going on the UFO file. But here's another thing, which is that Garrison knew him. And Garrison was part of the FBI early on before he became the DA of New Orleans. And so he talks all about, oh yeah, we used to meet all the time. So he knew him. So now we're starting to look at, like, these are people that are directly around the UFO file. And, when you get into the early pieces of how the UFO file got started in the first place with Kenneth Arnold and his sightings and all the rest, all the people with links directly to New Orleans and the assassination are going to be there. And one of those people is Fred Chrisman, who I've covered on this program before. I'm going to go into Chrisman later, but one of the things I want to say about Chrisman is Garrison has him testifying and thinks that he is an assassin sent in by these defense contractors and that he was involved in the shooting in Dealey Plaza. So the crisscross with the UFO file and the assassination is thick. It's like a web that's so thick that can't be ignored. But where does it lead? Now, what's interesting is someone else who along that line shows up this way is Oswald, because after all, when he's leaving Riley, which is the job that he has in New Orleans, he tells everyone that I'm going to work for NASA. And interestingly enough, when Garrison goes and tries to interview all of his fellow employees at Riley, he finds out that most of them have gone on to work for either defense contractors or for NASA. So what was the link there? Obviously, whenever you get around this assassination, you're dealing with not the mafia or the Cubans and all the rest of it. You're dealing with NASA. You're dealing with aerospace companies. You're dealing with Boeing. You're dealing with this X-Protect thing, which knows how to hide itself and embed itself in these different places. And that's how it remains obscured. I'm going to go deeper on this, and we're going to see just how that arc between 1947 and 1963, how much that thread hits. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 140, going deep for you tonight on the JFK assassination. The 59th anniversary will be on Tuesday. And we know that they have not, there's a whole scandal beyond the assassination, which is the CIA records of the assassination. That's a 59-year scandal that's been going on. And the person who, first of all, Congress under law mandated a law that the records were to come out in 2017 on October 26th. That's 5 years ago now. And that's law. That's, that's voted, and it's already a law. So any excuse that they come up with is absurd. They've been blocking and blocking. One of the stories that came out that I found tantalizing, was so interesting, was between Judge Napolitano, is that commentator, does a lot of conservative commentary, he's a libertarian, and Gerald Celente. So they were talking, and I found out that Napolitano made a series of these interviews where he talked about this. And he said, well, actually, Trump was all set, because he was friends with Trump before they had a falling out. And he said Trump was all set to release the records. He had told him that. And he said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to review the records and release them. And then when he didn't, Napolitano went to him and said, what was the problem? Don't treat the public like children. You have to do this. And then Trump said, no, I can't. You don't understand. I've seen what's in there. Like, there's no way I can let those out. And Napolitano said, well, this is the whole point behind, what you're doing. You're about opening things up. And he said, Andrew, you don't understand. No one could let out what's in there. Like, you wouldn't believe it. So, that sounds to me like there's an exotic aspect involved that isn't just the CIA assassinated President Kennedy, which is what anyone who looks into the case realistically assumes anyway. I certainly do. There's a piece in there, and obviously there is something in the JFK records. And part of the excuses that they've been giving, like, oh, it's still a national security issue. There's a December deadline now, December 11th, when we're supposed to get those records. Now, if you look at the different committees that investigated the JFK assassination, you're going to find that the records for the House Assassination Committee, we can't see till 2050. The Pike Commission, which looked into the intelligence involvement in all this, we don't get to see their records till 2050. The Church Committee, those records are 2038. Who's even going to be, I'm sort of looking after these things by then. So they have such stealth archives in relation to this. And the stealth archive aspect in the files, believe it or not, some people have said to me over the years, well, what's going to be in the files anyway? CIA is never going to let out the story. And they're right that it's not going to be, they're not going to admit inside those files. However, I've become convinced after reading the story of Robert Kennedy meeting immediately after the assassination with the CIA director, that there's some mechanism or booby trap associated with those records, and that in releasing them, there isn't a way to release them without letting this piece out. It activates something, which is why they delay and delay and delay. Now, we have picked up things from these records coming out, and we know that we've seen, for example, some unusual things when the stealth archives hit. For example, when the archives around Senator Joseph McCarthy came out, and Dr. Farrell went through them and did 2 books on them. What did we learn? We learned that Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn were investigating Project Blue Book and the Roswell incident. So no one has ever connected those dots in history. What is it in relation to the stealth archives here? These archives are archives. We know that they're there. The media will tell you, oh, there's a battle over those records. So-and-so has done it. The Mary Farrell organization, in fact, no relation to Joseph, they were the ones who kept all these Kennedy records over the years, and they've tried to build it out to the public and solve the assassination. They're now suing the Biden administration. We've seen this from time to time. Jefferson Morley sued the CIA for information on this because they know, and they've figured out where some of these train tracks are. And so somehow inside those records there is something. There must be, because why else would Trump talk to Napolitano in that fashion? Think about it. Trump was the most powerful man in the world at the time. His uncle, John Trump, was so hardcore. What do you got? His uncle was so hardcore that he put forward the idea that I learned all I know from my uncle. So let's think about that and really kind of start to see Trump and his position in all this a little bit differently. Yes.
Is it the Bob Dean information about the 4 different alien groups, including one which looks exactly like humans? Could it be that? Because out of everything that I know, that's the one thing that would be truly terrifying for people. And like that episode of Twilight Zone, right?
Well, that's really true. I think that, Dean is really excellent testimony. And that's part of what they were studying around the UFO file, for sure. The CIA records directly relating to the Kennedy assassination must, in my opinion, must have something directly to do with the UFO file. I think that this is the key to it, which is why they can't do anything with it. And why it could never get out, because it would destroy. Somehow it rocks the very base of that deep state, which has basically grown up and militaristically ruled the world, but and especially in America. But if there's something that would come out, so if they came out and they said, well, CIA agents were involved in a coup activity, and this would be a shock and all the rest of it. Oh, the history, the Cold War and all the rest of it. Well, a lot of us already know that they participated in it. Why would, they want the cover and all the rest of it, but they've admitted to a number of different things. What's interesting to me is that they want to come forward and say, we're giving you disclosure on the UFO file. And, they've been pushing and pulling with that recently, but they've tried different ways recently to come out with this UFO threat piece and then come through and say, well, we're releasing this and it's coming out. But really, on the JFK thing, it doesn't work like that. The JFK thing is nonstop denial. And they don't know how to get out of that situation because it goes right to the heart of their own authority. Because not only were they involved in it, but the reason that they were involved in it, they don't want to let out. That, to me, has the earmarks of the truth around it. But we're going to go deeper still. What else you got?
Elizabeth Huss, was JFK onto Operation Paperclip?
Oh, yeah. No question about it. He, and he understood the value that we were getting and that we were in a competition with the Soviets. He had no disillusion about that. But the problem is they had their own space group, the Nazi NASA scientists. And so at a certain point, he has McNamara go there. And these documents only came out in 2015. But he comes back and Kennedy says, I don't understand. It sounds like you're talking about 2 different space programs. And this gets into something very interesting because the 2 programs at the time, one of them was called Blue Gemini, the other one was Dynasaur, Dynasor. Now, what's interesting about these is they come up in this milieu of the Nazi takeover of the military machine. And here's how it works. The ex-Nazi, as it were. So when Oswald returns from Russia, he is living here with the Paynes. And he and his wife, Marina, who is the daughter of a GRU colonel, basically intelligence colonel in the Soviet Union, should be very hard to get her in here. It's very easy. She comes, and with their child, they're living with the Paynes. Now, Ruth Payne is a Quaker, and later we're going to find out that her sister works for the government and that her tax records are not available when Jim Garrison goes to get them. So Michael Payne, though, is very interesting because Michael Payne comes out of Harvard, and his dad is the man, his stepdad is the man who developed the helicopter, Arthur Young. Arthur Young and his mom, Michael Payne's mom, are involved in the group called the Nine. And interestingly, along this line, Gigi Young has been doing a series of videos on Mars, but the last one that she did focused on this, Puharich, who was involved in setting up the Nine. So that's a must-see. Definitely getting into that one. But let's go a little bit further with this. Arthur Young is going to develop a consciousness institute here in Boston and also in California. And in fact, he will say that he got his visions of doing the helicopter from, like thin air, that he saw it as like a vision. So he's a very visionary type, and so is his wife. So Michael Payne doesn't do so well at Harvard, but Arthur Young says, well, you can take this job down in Texas and at Bell Helicopter. And I've given you a reference there, and they're going to put you right in. And he's doing great down there. But he's working under a former Nazi general named Walter Dornberger. And Walter Dornberger sort of takes him on. Now, interestingly enough, Oswald, when he's back from Russia, is staying with Michael Payne and his wife, Ruth. So this is odd right away because Oswald's going to be set up as the assassin of President Kennedy in just a short period of time. So the person he's staying with, they're bothering to open their doors to this guy who has no money and his Russian wife. And it just so happens that Dornberger was Werner von Braun's boss when he was in Nazi Germany in their space program. And General Dornberger was actually up for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. And he was saved because our friend von Braun said, I need him. What you want me to do can't work if I don't have him in my team. So that whole apparatus of Oswald staying with the Paynes and Payne being a protege of Dornberger and Dornberger coming to America and running Bell Helicopter is all because von Braun saves him and he becomes part of this machine. You're also going to find, if you look at President Nixon's dining list when he's in the White House, you're going to find Dornberger's a regular guest over there.
Wow.
So we're looking at that influence. It's pretty hardcore. And remember, Dornberger's behind the X-15 and the way we've tracked X technology on this program. The X-15 still set records in 1960 that we can't top now for manned space plane flight. So, something interesting is going on there with Dornberger on the technology program. Now, one of the things I want to point out about Kennedy and the situation and the fix that he's in is that, on one hand, he has the military being too aggressive, and on the other hand, he has this whole CIA apparatus, which is out of control. And there are also moves to, basically take his presidency in a totally different direction. And he has his own people and he has his own program. So there's a battle here, and he is working with these different groups around the country, and he'll work, if somebody runs a particular place in Central America, he's working with them, whereas the Central Intelligence Agency wants just their people in. So they want one group that they can rely on, where they hand select the leaders, like the World Economic Forum. So Kennedy's working with individual people. They might call them dictators in Africa and other places, but he wants to work with the nationalists in their own scene and not impose a government from the outside. This is a kind of a very important difference in how they do things. But when we get into the space side, it's a real problem, because he's trying to take control of this program around NASA, and he's finding there's already a group that's active at NASA, and I don't have a whole lot of control over them. So this is where we get into the UFO piece. Here's something that is crucial, which we brought forward on this program. If you watch the X series, you know it quite well, which is that the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, was close friends with E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt was top CIA person in the Kennedy administration, and after and before. And he's well known to being involved in the JFK assassination as well. And I have a few interesting things to put on the record about him. But Caddy, who I've spoken to many times, has been on this program, and we've had a number of conversations. He famously put on the record that E. Howard Hunt told him, before he went to prison for Watergate. And remember, they're close, and he's telling him this in private. So it's not, here's some CIA disinformation for you. This is a private conversation. And Caddy says, why were they involved in killing President Kennedy? And Hunt says, President Kennedy was killed over the UFO file because he was going to share it with the Russians. He was going to share a most vital national security secret with the Russians. That's coming from a level and a caliber of a spokesman that, when you get to that level, that's somebody who would know. And the fact that he told his best friend in private, this is something that makes a lot of sense to me. The UFO field has avoided Caddy, and they've avoided his putting this on the record that the UFOs were the reason for the Kennedy assassination. They've actually hid out on the Caddy issue. Caddy's still very much alive, still very healthy. He's on the record. We know, we can check out his background, unlike a lot of these bozos. He was the Watergate lawyer. That's one of the most high-level figures that ever has put their stamp on the UFO field. And he's said it in relation to the JFK assassination. That's a blockbuster thing. But instead, the UFO field is like, Lou Elizondo is, I'm sure he was in a secret program. He's a whistleblower. So you have a problem, kind of a disconnect from reality in the working of these fields. And this is something I want to bring through with dark journalism, which is we do actually have things on the record which can steer us in the right direction. The problem is the apparatus and the way that things are promoted and brought forward, the level of education and assimilation is, on the level of like a 9-year-old or something around so many of these subjects. Then when you go into very well-versed intellectual fields, like people who study deep state assassinations or the Kennedy assassinations, they're not interested in the UFO part, which is also why they're not really taking Caddy and going and researching what he's saying in relation to UFOs, because they want to avoid the UFO thing.
It's a third rail.
It is. And the UFO people don't have the depth. And some who are like, I'm really against that government. Give us those files. The damn government is against us. And then government people, CIA people come out and say like, hey, we're going to give you disclosure. They're like, these guys are great. Let's get behind these guys. So there's a really big problem. I don't know how, as a collective that moves forward. All I can tell you is the information's there. And you can, if you had sophisticated people working on this, if you go through the work of like Dr. Farrell or Gigi Young on this, you can move that whole thing. People can understand things on a totally different level. Think about like Gaia TV or something like that.
Can I make the suggestion that it's just too overwhelming emotionally, that in a way people want to compartmentalize the conspiracy they can handle? I know.
Oh, I agree.
So there's
it's like a comic
liberals.
book. It's like a comic book version.
Well, I mean,
it doesn't have anything to do with politics at all. And, I think what you're saying is interesting, which is they want to keep their life uncomplicated on that level. They want kind of a simple formula. Oh, hey, the Black Knight satellite. That's interesting, but it's, there's a whole apparatus of the thing behind it. So I think we're at an impasse as far as the researchers go. The deep state people are not adopting the UFO file, and they won't get into it and suss out the details and find what's real there. And the UFO field doesn't have the depth to understand the government manipulation of the issue, So where were you going with that?
That's okay. We can skip over to this. Do you want to bring up Dr. Mary's monkey at all?
Well, that's very interesting. I still have things to cover.
Okay.
But that for sure is worthy of a show in and of itself. But I do feel very much like, we can go places as we understand these things. So if Howard Hunt went on the record with Caddy and said JFK was killed over the UFO file, then we have kind of an opening about understanding the assassination. I can show you from a number of different angles how this is true. But there's one central historical word on it. That's one historical anecdote. Let's do something interesting here that I wanted to get to. And that's a shot of Ferrie, by the way, when he was an airline pilot. He was known as the person who trained Barry Seal. Barry Seal was doing all the drug running and all the rest of it. He was in the same, it was like, Barry Seal was like a later version of Oswald. And they know how to use these people. I want to point out something about the actual incident of the assassination in relation to the Secret Service. There were some pictures I found on this that really were telling, and I want to just point them out briefly so we understand. There's something that's understood about the JFK assassination, which I think is crucial. It's called the Secret Service stand down. And that is that, the entire incident, as Fletcher Prouty pointed out, they would have never allowed the turn that gets them onto Elm Street. There were much better routes which didn't expose him to danger from 3 different directions. Also, there were a lot of open windows in vulnerable places, which they don't allow that to happen. What they do is they send guys out in advance and they don't allow certain things to be happening. Now, and he knew a lot about security. In fact, Prouty had to go to Mexico City before President Eisenhower went there. So he understood what the protocols and the rules were. And there were a lot of those protocols which were flouted in the JFK assassination. And in some cases, they were intentionally told to stand down. Here's something that we can see visually from the people who study the Secret Service. It's very crucial. On the back of the limousine are these handles. So you can see very clearly there. And ordinarily, in the situation where the president is in a motorcade, you have 2 Secret Service agents riding on the back of those. Just previous to Dealey Plaza, here is President Kennedy, and there are the 2 agents on the limo standing there behind him. It's very obvious that, they're there to look for any other threats and also to kind of block a clear visual of being able to assassinate the president. In Love Field, the Secret Service chief tells the agents who are going to be on the back of the limousine to get off. And there's the classic Secret Service stand down where the agent is about to get on to the back of the limo here. And this gentleman is also, he was going to get out and ride the other tail. And he's told by the Secret Service commander, I think his name is Roberts, that no, there's not going to be anybody riding on the back of that. So that's intentional security stripping on the spot. So they intentionally took them off because somebody in that group leading the Secret Service understood this guy is going to get shot later and we can't have our guys on the back blocking that shot. There are also strange commands about Dealey Plaza and how nobody should be in the park that's across from the grassy knoll which is very odd because you'd want a bunch of people there waving and all the rest of it. But they don't want the shot to go through and kill a civilian while they're after the main target. So there's a lot of knowledge going on in advance of all this and how it's going to play out. And remember, Oswald and his job in the Texas Schoolbook Depository, here's the official story. Oswald hated the president and he hated America, and he was a Soviet defector, even though he worked for a right-wing FBI chief just before he moved to Texas. And then 6 weeks before he gets a job, and this is 6 weeks before the president actually visits Texas, and the trip isn't announced, but he gets a job on the actual motorcade route. And he just so happens to have a great view of the president as he goes by. What luck for a presidential assassin, huh? Shucks. And then he pulls off 3 shots that nobody else can pull off. And then, including shots from the front when he's in the back and all the rest of it. And, not only that, but he beat his wife, and he was a psychopath, and he was such a lowlife. He was working for $1.25 an hour, and he had no future. So, this is the story that they set up around Oswald. In fact, as I mentioned, Oswald had a high security clearance, which I have. This is an interesting book. And it's Paris Flamand. Paris Flamand wrote really excellent books, and they're hard to come by. This one is not so hard, but
it's expensive though.
Yeah, his Assassination of America book is that one of the hardest books to get. And if you have it, I will buy it from you. And I have some volumes of it, but the entire set has just gone off market. It's goner.
You can't even find a record of it on the internet practically.
There's something wrong with this. Paris Flamand was, he was a huge researcher who had a very large cult following, and he'd been in, radio, and he'd done all kinds of things. And his books are, I'm glad I have the books of his that I do, but the other volumes of Assassination of America, the New Orleans portions, are almost impossible to get. All right, so a couple of things about Oswald and who he was. Now, Kerry Thornley went into the same unit as Oswald and was stationed in Atsugi. He's a fellow Marine. Thornley is an interesting character for a few reasons, but one of the things I'm going to tell you about Thornley is he wrote a novel about Oswald before Oswald became the world-famous would-be alleged assassin of President Kennedy. So that's kind of interesting too. And here's the other weird thing about the novel that he wrote. Oswald in that book has a twin. So think about the two Oswalds thing that we see so often, and then think, how did this guy have the foresight to write a novel about Oswald beforehand? But in any case, they question him, and he actually gets into the Warren Commission with the questioning because they're trying to find out exactly what level that Kennedy was on. And so they're asking him, they're saying, I don't understand, how did Oswald get secret radar clearance that's higher than yours or other people at Atsugi? And so here we go. I'm going to give a little bit of this. Oswald was apparently not the run-of-the-mill Marine. Appearing before the Warren Commission, one of Oswald's fellow Marines at El Toro in California was Kerry Thornley, discussed his own security clearance, which allowed him to work on secret radar equipment. Thornley was then asked about Oswald's clearance. Quote, Thornley, Oswald, I believe, had a higher clearance than I did. I believe he at one time worked in the security files. It is the S&C files somewhere at LTA and at El Toro. Did you ever work in security files? No, sir. And that was a level of clearance. Probably a secret clearance would be required at least. It was at least higher than the clearance about which you spoke. Yes, sir. The commission apparently never considered it pertinent to inquire what business a Pravda subscriber dubbed Comrade by his peers had in the top secret security files of a key Marine radar installation. But Thornley had other significant information about Oswald, which he never told the commission because he was never asked. The author possesses a copy of a signed affidavit by Kerry Thornley, sworn in Los Angeles on September 28, 1967. He reveals that Oswald left the El Toro Marine unit, in which they both served, and defected, in quotes, to Russia. Thornley was transferred to the Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, where Oswald had been stationed before his transfer to El Toro. Atsugi plays an important role in Jim Garrison's account of Oswald's evolving CIA connections. Garrison contends that Oswald was trained as an intelligence officer at El Toro and at Japan's Atsugi Air Force Base, and continued his intelligence training at El Toro, thus his study of the Russian language and his subscription to Soviet newspapers unimpeded by his superiors. One of Garrison's investigators, Tom Bethel, spent a week going over this and in the National Archives, Washington, D.C., and unearthed a list of 51 CIA documents classified top secret and inaccessible to the public until September 2038. One of the secret files, CD 931, is labeled Oswald's Access to Information About the U-2, Secret. After Garrison's office released the list of classified CIA files, the New Orleans Sunday States Time item comments, "It is not known what access Oswald may have had to secret U-2 files. There has been speculation, however, that electronics work for the project may have been done at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, where Oswald served as a Marine." Jim Garrison had this to say: "I have 24 years of military experience behind me as active duty and in the reserves, and I've never had any access to the U-2. In fact, I've never seen one. But apparently a self-proclaimed Marxist, Lee Harvey Oswald, who were assured had no ties to any government agency, had access to information about the nation's most secret high-altitude reconnaissance plane." Interestingly enough, the U-2 was developed at Area 51. So this idea of Oswald working closely with the U-2 is really fascinating. Here's the other weird thing. There's a story out there. Another military guy came forward and said that he had flown out to Dallas and they had diverted the plane on the day of the assassination, and it landed by the Trinity River, and he was on a military plane, and two people got on the plane. And one of the people looked like a Cuban guy, and the other one was Lee Harvey Oswald. And that they were sitting there, and that they went from there. There was no conversation between him and these two people. And that the announcer said, "We are now taking a different route. We're not going to land in Dallas. Whatever, we had an emergency. We are going to Roswell, New Mexico," which is where they landed. Now, that story, and the person who told it, he had the background, he wrote about it, he stuck to his story until he died. So there was a weird piece that is in the Kennedy literature, and it's a story about how when when Oswald was being taken out the front, that a lot of people were surprised because they had already seen Oswald being taken out the back of the theater when he was accosted by the police and pointed out under unusual circumstances while watching a movie at the Texas Theater. So a lot of those witnesses were shocked that he went out through the front when they read it later, because they said, "We all saw him dragged out through the back." And so this idea that, the second Oswald basically was taken out and he was flown to Roswell lingers around this story as well. Remember, from the very start, Oswald has an unusual signature around him. And he also, in being this kind of like, I have no money and all this stuff, but I'm going to defect to the Soviet Union and get in. We're dealing with something very unusual with Oswald immediately. And he seemed to always have the money to do what he needs to do, travel the world. This kind of template was set up when you look at Mark David Chapman later, the assassin of John Lennon. He also travels all around the world. He also has a low-level job, and there's a lot of lack of explanations for where he gets his art collection and all these things. This is a signature of how this group works. We've seen it before, and it's not always as easy as, a CIA agent. It's some branch in there that has those connections and is related to the exotic technology or assassination programs. And of course, Oswald, there's no evidence. Should say in the official story, they always say, well, Oswald was able to, shoot Kennedy with the magic bullet and all that stuff. So, the real case on the ground is there's no evidence that Oswald shot Kennedy at all, in fact. And the magic bullet thing, which was an invention of the time, we can look back on it now and just say, this is a story they made up to save face. So what does that tell you about the real story? And why did they pick Oswald as the patsy after carefully crafting his image over all these years? We're going to get into that. Everyone watching the Dark Journalist show, deep tonight with you on JFK and the 59th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I've gone over and I'm going to go a little bit more and then we're going to jump in. How are you doing over there?
Doing great.
Any questions?
Richard Warner wants to know, please ask DJ about how Jim D. Eugenio publicly said the JFK UFO documents are fake. I would just like his view on it.
Well, D. Eugenio, although he does a really good job on the Cuba thing and the Garrison case, he's another one of these deep state guys who's allergic to the UFO file. So there's so much information around the UFO aspect. We've laid out a lot of it here tonight. But when you're a deep state researcher, like he is, he wants to find the thing to unravel the government's cover story. He doesn't want to hear about the UFO aspect at all. And that's why, like when you're in the UFO field, a lot of those researchers don't have the depth to go after the government assassination programs and all that. They're just like, oh, hey, we need to get behind this CIA move for transparency, not realizing that the CIA has been the one that's sitting on the program for 80 years, the 75 years. So that's just a kind of a kink in a lot of those deep state researchers. He's a fantastic researcher when it comes to aspects of the JFK assassination, but then you run into something that is, it's somebody's aversion and they run for the hills. And then as a result of that, you get a lot of kind of, they don't back anything up. They don't know anything about UFOs because they've never looked into it, because that stuff was always seemed like it was ridiculous. Because after all, the Central Intelligence Agency through the media made it seem ridiculous for a long time. The fact that the government is starting to say about this, well, there's a UFO threat and there is a UFO thing, here's a UFO office to study it, actually, if anything, should just create gigantic foreboding and apprehension. But yeah, I think maybe he should read Fletcher Prouty's thing about how they're preparing aliens for a UFO threat since they lost the Soviet threat. Okay, a couple of quick things. Admiral Byrd. I mentioned Admiral Byrd. Admiral Byrd, as we've seen, his cousin D.H. Byrd owned the Texas School Book Depository. D.H. Byrd invested in a company called Lingo Vout, and they called it LTV. And interestingly enough, LTV was worth practically nothing. And our friend D.H. Byrd bought it just before the assassination. By 1965, his stock investment was worth over $50 million profit, which is the equivalent to about 500 million today. So the reason LTV did so well was because of the Vietnam War, because they helped create the electronics and helicopters for it. That type of market manipulation also took place in relation to the 9/11 event. These are the things that need to be studied, and they started right in the heart of the JFK assassination. What's odd about our friend, when we go back in time and we look at Admiral Byrd and his connection, is that there's also Harry Byrd, who was the senator from Virginia. That's his brother. And by the way, this is Admiral Byrd in Beacon Hill, And I know exactly where this spot is. As a matter of fact, when I was 16 years old, I used to walk by it every day to go to work. So isn't it weird how life turns out? Nice place. Strange thing about Admiral Byrd I want to put on the record, which is his son was going to this event in DC, coming from Boston, from this very location at Beacon Hill. And he disappeared. But he was going to speak on the incredible exploits of his famous father. So what happens is people have seen him. He's babbling incoherently. And then he's found in a storage unit in this place, and his clothes are kind of on backwards, sort of thing. And no one knows what happened there. But he was on his way to speak at this DC conference about the incredible Admiral Byrd trip and Operation High Jump and all the rest of it. He was not known to have any emotional problems. And this idea of people seeing him kind of babbling incoherently and dressed weird, and then he shows up in a storage unit after having, you know, a normal life like the rest of us, he disappeared, and nobody knew what was going on. When he's found dead, they eventually decide, I guess it was suicide. Completely ridiculous. But think about the thread now. Think about the Texas School Book Depository. Think about Byrd. Think about LTV. Then think about this mysterious death. And you start to see there are a lot of pieces here that are largely unexplored. How would you like that an Antarctica connection to the JFK assassination? It's strange. When I found out about it, I couldn't believe it. But Dry Hole Byrd is also interesting because he's very close to LBJ. Not only that, but he's close and employed and invested in a charity of George de Mohrenschildt. So I'm going to read that piece for you now. And it's interesting because a lot of the researchers, just like when someone mentioned Eugenio before, it's very interesting to me because a weird thing is happening with the best researchers, which is they're being manipulated by propaganda now. And they were much sharper then. So 10 years ago, these guys were outstanding. They're being manipulated by propaganda. They're losing it. And it's problematic. There's no reason to go into any of the names. So a lot of them are obvious, but this is a pattern that I'm seeing, which is the people who've done good research being manipulated and swayed through political type activity to accept the idea that the deep state will save the day, and, you know, hooray for the CIA against populism and bizarre things like that. So that people that I would respect and understand the JFK assassination dramatically well will now shill for things like the COVID op. So it's tough. It's tough. But I'm going to read this for you. This is from Family of Secrets, which is an outstanding story about the Bush family by Russ Baker. It's a classic, in fact. And Who, What, Why is a great site that he did. Unfortunately, he became so extreme in his beliefs, that he became one of these people who was like, those anti-vaxxers, and nonsense like that, and just bought the CIA pablum. But back here, he was quite good. So let's read a little bit of this, and it's going to give us a hint about Dry Hole Byrd and his relationship with de Mohrenschildt. A study showed that in September 1962, just weeks before he began to squire Oswald, George de Mohrenschildt incorporated a charity ostensibly devoted to the study of cystic fibrosis and put D. Harold Byrd's wife on the board. Mrs. Byrd's role on the charity board would have created a convenient excuse for de Mohrenschildt to have been interacting with her husband during this period. Other board members included J. Edgar Hoover's good friend, Paul Rogorsky, good friend and White Russian community's godfather. On May 14th, 1963 in Dallas, the U.S. Air Force presented D. Harold Byrd its scroll of appreciation for his work with the Civil Air Patrol. where Oswald was a cadet. Among the Air Force generals he counted as friends was Charles Cabell, Allen Dulles' CIA deputy director, key Bay of Pigs figure, and brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell, also a good friend of Byrd's. Now, let's think about this for a minute. What we found out through the limited release of documents, which Trump did, to his credit, put out in 2017, is that Mayor Cabell, was in fact a CIA asset. And this wasn't clear before, even though his brother was deputy of Allen Dulles. But Cabell was deeply involved in setting up the assassination motorcade route for JFK's visit. And he, as somebody who was in that role, we have to consider also that the person then who had fired his brother, the president, had fired Cabell and Allen Dulles, both in 1961, for trying to get him to invade Cuba. So therefore, Cabell is now chaperoning Kennedy around Texas. And he's like, oh yeah, here's how you're going to go out. You're going to go out through this weird turn and go down Elm and all the rest of it. So the CIA, in fact, is controlling the motorcade route. The other person who's involved in that motorcade route is a Secret Service agent named Winston Lawson. Winston Lawson, when he's setting up the motorcade route and when he's setting up things there in Texas, he's using the Doomsday Network communications. Now, this is really strange because that's the COG communications network. There's no reason for him to have been doing that. And he admits later, oh yeah, we used it, in setting it up. One of the things that is pointed out by Professor Peter Dale Scott about Winston Lawson, as far as, having characters that are associated with the COG thing, being involved in these deep events around these political activities. Like we've seen, John Dean was very, very big on the continuity of government program. He's the lawyer for Nixon, and he is the one who takes him down by revealing the taping system and all the rest of it. So John Dean, in fact, becomes the most damaging witness. Well, what was John Dean doing before he was lawyer for Nixon? He was working directly for the continuity of government program. So those COG people just show up whenever there's a deep event. Of course, Cheney and Rumsfeld created the second version of COG in the 80s, and they show up there just in time for 9/11 to activate it. So that whole branch of continuity of government emergency planning personnel needs to be looked at. But Winston Lawson's an early snapshot because there he is, somebody using the Doomsday Network to set up the motorcade. And oddly enough, Professor Scott found incredible lies in his testimony about the motorcade and what was happening because he was in it after all. He's one of those Secret Service agents. And that's a really interesting point of view for us to look at it and say, someone in there told the Secret Service to stand down. This is a crucial piece, I think, when looking at the JFK assassination. The other thing I want to say that throws out any idea of Oswald being the shooter and all the rest of it is there's the gun that was found at the scene of the crime was a Mauser. So the cops who were on the scene in the beginning held up the gun. One of them ran a sporting goods store, and he said, look, it's a 7.65 Mauser. So Roger Craig had this testimony, and he died. He's one of the witnesses who died under strange circumstances. Oh, he shot himself in the chest with a shotgun. How exactly is that going to work? But it's interesting because he really put it on the record that the gun that they found was not a Mannlicher Carcano, which is the thing they could trace to Oswald. So there was some goof up there when they were trying to pin this all on Oswald in the beginning. And the 7.65 Mauser was the gun that they actually found. Totally different type of weapon and identified by two different policemen. Seymour Weitzman was the guy who owned the sporting goods store. He knew guns, and he said, oh yeah, it's a Mauser. Look at the stamp on the bottom. That's the original testimony. Later, they changed it because they were like, oh, Oswald, he ordered a gun through the mail. It was a Mannlicher Carcano. That's what he was firing. So that gun magically turns into a Mannlicher Carcano. That's what they could do then. And they still do it now, don't get me wrong, but it was so easy for them just to lay this out. But what they did was they created a wave of truth seekers and, people looking for an honest version of what happened in those events. It's 59 years later, and the records from the CIA are still locked up. What does that tell you? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight here on the JFK assassination. What we're going to do, we're going to take your questions starting now. I'm going to turn it over to Miss Olivia. And the rest of the stuff that I have here, I'm going to pepper in as we answer your questions. And with that, Miss Olivia?
David Tormina says, if you were truly protecting the president, you would never accept a stand-down order.
Yeah, well, the Secret Service is run like the military. Like, you follow orders. And if they were giving him that order, then this is what was going on. I do find it very strange. Before I leave Admiral Byrd and Harry Byrd, I wanted to put this on the record. Did you know that back there in both of the family lineage, that Pocahontas is in their family lineage of the Byrds, and she marries a very famous tobacco farmer in Virginia, and she becomes, the mother figure of the whole clan that will become the Byrds. How unusual is that? This is a very, very interesting family, and I didn't even get into Harry Byrd. Pocahontas. Take it away, Miss Pocahontas.
Mark Hovespian. Was there a shooter at a storm drain?
Yeah, I think there were a number of different positions. Someone sent me something once, which I'll never forget, which is, it was a clock that was in Dealey Plaza, and it was a puff of smoke in front of the clock, which I found interesting. But the positions, I think, traditionally that we see are, there were shooters in the Daltex building. There was a distraction operation at the Texas School Book Depository to cause enough attention there. And there were shooters on the grassy knoll. And there was something, probably a radio team operating from the storm drain. That's a pretty good setup. I would actually say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 bullets were shot. But those forensics, there's a lot of different versions of the story, but there's no question on the frontal headshot, we have the doctors at Parkland Hospital who went on the record and over again told us that the shot was from the front and that the throat shot was also from the front. So that's 2 shots from the front. And there's the shot in the back, which they pretended was a shot in the back of the neck that went through the throat. And this is great. Ford, who was never known to be much smarter than, a squirrel, he admitted that, oh, well, we moved up the wound because it had to match. That's where Ford was coming from. And he got to be president. Hey.
Well, it proves the point that if the media is not willing to do their jobs as
watchdogs.
Yeah, as watchdogs, that they will.
It's the watchdog versus a puppy dog.
They can say the truth. They can get away with things because nobody's going to question them and nobody's going to hold their feet to the fire.
Oh, we've just been through this.
Exactly.
I mean, with the COVID op, the UFO threat thing would be exactly, the same. We're already seeing that they don't know anything about it. Even people who like to do good reports, like them or not, Tucker Carlson, people like that, Joe Rogan, people like that, they don't know anything about the UFO file. They have these CIA people come in and be like, well, that government needs to open up and give us those files, like get the truth from the government. These people are in the government. Did you check their history? Did you check Elizondo's history? He still works for the government. He's not an ex-government official whistleblower, Christopher Mellon, the guy was, involved in the Iraq war, worked for Clinton. What do you want? You have to look into the backgrounds on these people and see where they're coming from and why they would want to talk to you about the UFO file. Tucker Carlson's going to sit there with Dr. Gary Nolan, who does high fives on Twitter with Fauci, and talk about how we need to get those UFO records out. Well, Gary Nolan's 10 years CIA. Maybe ask him that. Say, well, just being involved with the CIA for a decade, does that give you problems about telling the truth to me sitting here right now? Is that a problem? If you tell the truth, does your life and your family and everything go up in smoke the minute you say the truth because the CIA doesn't like you to let out their secrets? Then these people would just, that would be the end of it. And instead, in some kind of weird morph, those people are becoming the face of the UFO file, the same people who have blocked it since 1947. We know the phenomena goes back even further than that.
Well, isn't that because BlackRock and Vanguard own everybody and everything at this point?
Well, I think that's pretty significant, the level of interference financially and the power from those groups. I don't look at them specifically as just it. They're a big piece of it. You're getting closer now.
I don't even know. I mean, they represent
get that mic closer.
They represent forces,
yes.
Right? So there's, right hand, left hand, puppet
yes.
masters, basically. Everybody is owned.
Well, how did Professor Scott describe the deep state? This is important for us to keep in mind in speaking about these things. So he said it was organized crime on one level. It was the Central Intelligence Agency and intelligence agencies. And then it was the groups that the Central Intelligence Agencies and other intelligence groups contract, like Booz Allen Hamilton. And then at the highest level, it was the financial management group and then the wealth that they managed and the power that it represented. That's Professor Scott's version of that system. So you're absolutely right. BlackRock should be right in the heart of that conversation.
Okay.
Good score, Miss Olivia.
Hugo. I'm not going to say the last name.
Oh, yeah. Hugo F.
Yeah, okay. Hugo F. Did the first shot come through the windshield and hit JFK in the throat? Do you want to talk about the windshield of the limo?
Yes. Well, one of the things that happened that we learned later is that there was an engineer at Ford, and that they sent the limo there, and they said to him, they gave him a secret job, which was replace that windshield. Don't ask any questions, basically. And that the windshield had a direct bullet path through the front. And that's how they shot President Kennedy initially, through the throat. And then the shot from the grassy knoll came from the side. They didn't need to go through the windshield. And that's how they got the kill shot. In terms of the shots from the back, I believe that they came from the Daltex building. And I think that the Texas School Book Depository had a kind of a well-established figure coordinating distraction there to give us that trail of Oswald there. And I also think that they told Oswald there that they were going to kind of simulate some situation. And what's interesting, what always stays with me is there's a huge kind of CIA agent, David Atlee Phillips, who was in charge of all covert operations in the Western Hemisphere. And before he died, he was always associated with this. And his brother, before he died of cancer, said, "Were you in Dallas on that day?" And he said to him, "Yes, I was." And the brother always knew that he was involved. But what's interesting about him is, as he died, they found at his bedside a very interesting novel. And it was all about a CIA agent who trained Oswald. And he said, "We trained him to assassinate Castro, and we went through it many times. I saw him in Texas, I saw him in New Orleans, and I saw him in Mexico City. And we went through it. He was going to assassinate him with a high-powered rifle from an office building." So this is weird because it's almost like, they're giving Oswald this thing that, like, look, we're going to assassinate Castro, and this is a scenario where here's a motorcade going by and all the rest of it. We'll put you in there, and it'll be just kind of like a dry run for what we're going to do. You won't have to fire any bullets or anything, but like, you just get ready for the whole thing. So he puts himself into position, and the motorcade goes by. They use the actual assassins, and then he's the perfect patsy. It's weird when you look back at him writing that novel at the end of his life. I always feel like that was telling us a whole lot, just like 7 Days in May is telling us a whole lot. I wanted to read a quick thing about the process of executive action. Oh, also, I can't miss this. This is odd. Later, Burt Lancaster will also play the mastermind, ex-protect mastermind of the JFK assassination in a movie called Executive Action, which comes out 20 years before the JFK movie. And just like he played the COG commander in 7 Days in May, here he is in Executive Action, creating his assassination team. And it's a pretty deep movie, in fact, for the period. And Mark Lane is one of the screenwriters. But there, again, is our friend Burt Lancaster. Is he trying to tell us something? Very good. What do you got?
Executive Action?
Yes.
Right. And that, of course, has one of my favorite scenes, haunting scene in it.
What is that?
I wish I could remember the exact quote, but it's where they're discussing how many people there are in third world countries. And they want to come to first world countries, and all of them want to reproduce, basically. And it's their job to create wars in those third world countries in order to stop
for
that.
Population decline.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. It's an advanced. Oh, that's a great scene. That's an advanced movie, and that's the movie where we get that thing about the actuary and how they got through an actuary the odds on all those Warren Commission witnesses being dead in a short period of time, and they play at the end of the movie, like, this person, how they were killed, a karate chop, mistaken for a deer, whatever it happens to be, all these strange things. Another weird piece I want to add here, since we mentioned Fletcher Prouty, I can't miss on mentioning Prouty without talking about what he thought was going on and why he left. And also the fact that, NSAM 57 was left back there, which was something Kennedy put in to suppress the power of the Central Intelligence Agency and make them a support group and defang all of their covert activities. He gives it to the Joint Chiefs. It's National Security Action Memorandum 55 through 57, but 57 was the key. And Fletcher Prouty talked about it often. At the end of his administration, after he had lost, President Trump activated National Security Action Memorandum 57, and they had a ceremony for it and all the rest of it. Now, I'm sure as soon as Biden got in, it was somehow nullified with another executive order. But this was a very strange activity taking place. And of course, we heard all those rumors as Trump was on his way out that he was going to let out both the UFO file and the JFK assassination file. How much do you want to bet that that stuff in some way, shape, or form landed at Mar-a-Lago and caused the nature of the raid and the trouble? I'd say it's a pretty good bet, in fact. But anyway, Prouty worked under Ed Lansdale. And Lansdale is a very weird character. He shows up in Indonesia and the government's overthrown, and he's the nature of this is a real hardcore ace on this piece. And he technically is Air Force, and they use him in the CIA and other operations, assassinations and all the rest. Well, interestingly enough, Halloween 1963, Ed Lansdale resigns from the Air Force. That's it. I've had enough. And so Fletcher Prouty, who worked directly for him, before he left, he sent Fletcher Prouty to Antarctica so that he wouldn't be around to do the security for Kennedy's trip to Texas. And he had a devil of a time getting out of Antarctica and getting back. And he expresses that story about being in New Zealand and reading the story of the assassination in Oswald, and they have the whole background and everything before they even had charged him with the crime, and somebody was already sending out his bio, his picture, and a business suit and all this stuff. So he's giving us that intel, but then he says the most interesting piece of all, which is that Ed Lansdale was in Dealey Plaza when all this was happening, and that he found pictures of it. And just to prove to himself, he sent the same picture to a number of different people who had worked with him. They said, what was Lansdale doing there? But this shot of them dragging these three tramps, which are, the tramps are a whole thing in themselves. It's heavy duty Masonic imagery of the three tramps who kill the king and all the rest. But in any case, this figure, and there's weird things that have been pointed out by people from time immemorial about the cops. Look at where the cops are standing. These are the men they're taking into jail. And they're so far ahead of them. They're like, there's no overseeing these guys. These are the guys that they grabbed off of the trains that were behind the grassy knoll. And they thought, okay, they're in the railway cars. Maybe they had something to do with the assassination. They take them in and they're released immediately. But the person who was walking by them here, his back is to the camera, but everyone who worked with him recognized that it was him. And through his ring, his walk, his hairline, everything. And that's Ed Lansdale reassuring the people that have been grabbed in the back, don't worry about it. Don't freak out. You're going to get out, and that there's no problem here. Fletcher Prouty said, that is Lansdale, and he was in Dealey Plaza. And the idea that he had left, this incredible position on Halloween, and here it is November 22nd, that gave him about 3 weeks to get ready for this. Another interesting thing is the entire Kennedy cabinet was out of the country. They were on their way to Asia. So this has something to do is if it becomes necessary for a military takeover, they needed these people away. And what happens is a very strange thing. It's kind of like a Mandela effect thing, which is they land in Hawaii and they're planning to go on to Japan. And the assassination happens and they turn around. Instead of going to Japan, they head back. And we're talking about the entire cabinet. Oddly enough, newspapers come out in Japan the next day that have them in Japan making their speeches and saying, so-and-so said this, and so-and-so made the case that American prosperity is right around the corner in partnership with Japan. So something weird was going on there. Those people were meant to be in Japan, and when they turned around, it's part of this whole thing. But stranger still is the fact that the Japanese newspaper quoted them having these speeches in Japan when they were actually never even made it. They stopped in Hawaii and turned around. So either that gives you some idea of how the press worked then, like they just made events into whatever they wanted them to be, or there's something just kind of Twilight Zone about that. Yes.
Able-bodied. Has it been proven that Bush Sr. was there at the plaza?
Well, here are the weird things. They always have shots of this guy who looks like Bush around there, but what's more important than that is that Bush called the FBI and he said, there's a Republican guy who's he's one of these Congress people, and he's making a lot of noises about assassinating President Kennedy. And this is on the day of the assassination. And what it is, basically, is it's a way to place him somewhere, making a call. It gives him a track record of reporting this guy.
It's like a Columbo episode.
It is indeed. And he is the only public official in his generation who, when they say, where were you when the JFK assassination happens, he says, oh, I forget. I don't recall. How could you not recall? So anyone who goes into the background on Bush understands his role and the family's role with the Central Intelligence Agency. It's explosive from the beginning. And, he takes on the role as the CIA director in the 70s, but the family was also deeply involved with that whole oil CIA connection down there. Remember, they're carpetbaggers from New England here going down to Texas and fitting in down there and creating this whole intel world. So I think rather than worrying about if Bush was actually in Dealey Plaza, to say he was involved in the assassination is not far afield at all. I think the Bushes were involved. Yes.
The Black Zionist. Please ask DJ if he has watched JFK Revisited.
Yes, of course. This is Oliver Stone coming back after 30 years of the JFK movie anniversary and offering a documentary which shows so many different elements which completely unravels the Warren Commission and the government denials and all the rest of it. Stone's done an excellent job of staying on it, and he understands that something very important and powerful took place in the transfer of power. And also, I think to see so many of his generation go to Vietnam, knowing that Kennedy was pulling out, is also significant. The thing that these people would help them even further in the deep research that they do is to consider the UFO file aspect in relation to this. And it's very easy to point out. One is that Oswald worked for the person who developed the UFO files for the FBI. That's Guy Bannister. That's the SMX file, Security Matter X, all of those. And the fact that Guy Bannister went all over the country hunting down the saucer cases. He's like the Fox Mulder character who creates the whole thing. And Oswald's working for him. And also Garrison knows who he is and thinks he's involved in the JFK assassination. That should open all the doors for the aerospace investigation into this. And when you get to the aerospace part, you're going to run flat-footed into the UFO file. There's no getting around it. Yes.
Ray Story, have Kennedy clan members ever reported a UFO sighting or encounter that you know of?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things there. I mean, there's a whole series of Robert Kennedy responding to people writing him about UFOs in the 50s and early 60s and being like, the president is very concerned about this just as you are, and so there's that, which is on the record. But I think importantly is Philip Corso went on the record, and he was somebody who we know worked for the Warren Commission, but he was somebody deeply involved with the UFO file and took a lot of heat for his book, Day After Roswell, but there's a lot in there. But what he said was that he regularly briefed both RFK and JFK on the UFO issue. So they were very well-versed going in and became even more well-versed. As a matter of fact, the central problem with the Kennedy administration battle with the CIA is that the CIA has so much control, and they're trying to work inside the Kennedy administration to reacquire and put back under the executive umbrella the UFO file piece, which is lost during the end of the Eisenhower administration through the finagling that was being done through that tiny corridor of the defense industry and the defense contractors, aerospace division, and the Central Intelligence Agency, saying, if you hand that over to us, we'll keep it secret and out of the public prying eye or any public information requests. And somehow that gave them the ability to take it over. And a lot of it has been locked up inside of the corporations as a result, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Hughes Aerospace, and others. So, you're talking about a lot there. And when you get into Hughes Aerospace, remember, it was Nixon as vice president who sets up the Hughes Medical Charity as a nonprofit entity, and then they can do all their space development through that entity and not pay the millions of dollars in taxes. It gives them an incredible lift, and it gives them an incredible advantage over the other aerospace companies. So therefore, the level that they're on, and if you go to my documentary on X-Protect, the UFO File Assassins, you're going to find out that Howard Hughes was very well versed. He saw UFOs from all of his flights. He was very well versed in it, and he knew, according to Bruce Morgan, who's the, who comes on the documentary and gives us all that incredible information. He's the son of Yvonne DiCarlo, and he knows a great deal about this. And he understands that Hughes is basically, he knows where the UFO graveyard is, as it were, in the desert. Yes.
Okay, I've got a series of questions here that are all related. Floor A, does DJ have any thoughts on what JFK Jr. believed or thought about his father's assassination? Christopher Bishop, if JFK Jr. was also a victim of the deep state, would there be any tie-in with the UFO file? And Mind Control Incorporated, DJ, what do we know about the claims of H. Clinton being involved in JFK Jr.'s death?
Well, the Clinton machine, just like the Warren Commission and the JFK investigations, has a death list that is, ever growing. And it's weird, beyond coincidental. And, it's a trademark. It's a fingerprint of how they operate, from Vince Foster to all these other people. There are UFO file signatures around the Clintons, including their work with Lawrence Rockefeller, including Hillary saying, "Oh, I'm going to be the UAP champion," in the 2016 election. And there's no question that they were going to chaperone this whole false CIA disclosure thing through DeLong and Elizondo with the Clintons. When she didn't get in, they were dealing with Trump, who was like, "I'm going to use Space Force to get the UFO file, which I've heard about from my uncle who worked for Vannevar Bush. I'm going to get all that back under control of the executive branch." So he didn't have any time for their op, which is why the TTSA op is so sloppy when it comes out. There's a lot of problems with it. DeLong is terrible. Elizondo can't get his story straight, pretends he doesn't work for the government anymore. He still works for the government. So for me, when I look at that, I say they didn't have the White House support. And this was a Democratic op. Podesta was involved in the heart of it. And, they suckered in people like Peter Levenda, whatever. I don't think that he had any vested interest in those people at all. He was just a writer. But when you talk about JFK Jr., you have to go deep. And you have to remember that he knew, because the family knew, that JFK had been assassinated as the result of a domestic conspiracy. That is, this is the note that came over to the Soviet Union and from Robert Kennedy and Jackie. They wrote to them because they were getting this kind of distressing thing of like, we weren't involved in any of this. And they wrote back to them through secret channels. And we understand, we know that he was killed through a domestic conspiracy, and that it happened. They understood it was the government that did it. And this is something that by the time Robert gets assassinated, then Jackie has to be under Onassis umbrella to have that kind of safety. So JFK Jr. grew up with that. He understands it quite well. What I did find out, which is fascinating, that I think adds to the story, is that he met secretly in New York with Princess Diana. And the story about what they talked about was whether or not she would basically blow the whistle on the royal family and the things that they were up to. But I think it might have been deeper in this sense. And I see them as kind of twin figures, that they're both under scrutiny and they're both going to get whacked in the classic terms. They're both going to be eliminated through this assassination machine. And I think there is some realization between the two that they have this in common. That's how I attribute them meeting. And she never does end up giving any interview for George Magazine, which reinforces that for me even a little bit further. It reminds me, I get kind of the Dorothy Kilgallen vibes from the whole thing. And I have a couple of things about the document that mentions Kilgallen here too, which I will get to before we're done. But that's where I kind of place that. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Irish guy, JG. Do the Kennedys and the Maxwells mix while they are in England?
I've got I've got interesting contacts between the Maxwells and Danny Casolaro. He had already figured out that a lot of the whole thing about Promise Software was being exploited directly through them, but they were returning his calls. There was communication back and forth there. In terms of the Kennedys, I haven't seen anything on that. If you have something, send it to me at admin@darkjournalist.com. A couple of quick things here. One, just for, in case you're new to the subject, I'm just going to put this on the record. Johnson said he doubted finding on assassination. So LBJ, who created the Warren Commission, doesn't even believe what they came up with. He actually goes on television and says, I think there could have been other people involved, and I never have been satisfied. So then he calls into the station. He has his aide call into Walter Cronkite and say, actually, don't put that out, you know. But let's read this. The Warren Commission said Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. Okay, we all know that's nonsense. When Connolly died last summer, researchers asked that the bullet fragments still in his body be recovered to resolve the issue. His family rejected the request. Connolly didn't believe in the magic bullet either, by the way, and he was shot by one of the bullets. Russell seemed to have no problem believing that Oswald fired separate shots that hit Kennedy and Connolly. And so what they have here is Senator Richard Russell, the Democrat of Georgia, a member of the commission. He goes in and he's talking with LBJ, and he says, look, you know, I don't think Oswald fired those shots, and I don't think he had the ability to do it. And so I don't believe in the magic bullet and all that stuff. And LBJ says, well, I don't believe in that nonsense either. So that gives you the impression that's on the record. So many, you know, so few things are on the record. Here's one that's on the record. LBJ doesn't believe the Warren Commission or the magic bullet or any of that. Neither does Richard Russell. The controversy over whether the same bullet struck Kennedy and Connolly of Texas, Governor John Connolly, began immediately after the assassination. President Johnson did not believe that one bullet struck the two officials, according to the tapes released on Friday at the National Archives, Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in Austin, Texas. Here's another thing that they have. They have in that library the X letter. The X letter is something that LBJ put in there as soon as he left office and said it should be opened in 2023. That's next year. And this whole piece could end up being quite interesting because they tried to open it early in the 90s after Nixon died, because they figured, oh, this must be related to Nixon, because at the end of his administration and with Nixon coming in, he was trying to blackmail Nixon by saying, I know that you try to derail the Vietnam peace talks till you got in and have your own peace plan, and that's illegal and all the rest of it. And Nixon said, I know you're involved in the JFK assassination and I will use it. So this is how their relationship worked. But what's interesting about this is LBJ, when he leaves office, he's just come through watching very closely, and we have tapes of him talking about the Garrison investigation, saying, why is this guy looking into me? So he starts to let out little things, and he shows up on Cronkite's show and he says, there could have been more people involved than just Oswald, which is incredible considering he set up the Warren Commission and all the rest of it. So on the record, just in case it ever comes up, LBJ didn't believe any of that, especially since he knew better. Here's another little piece like that. Nixon's plan to threaten the CIA on the JFK assassination. All right. This is an article by Jefferson Morley, who I've pointed out before. Morley was the guy who found out about someone named George Joannides, who was in charge of the Oswald project, basically the ultimate psychological operation. And he found out that this guy had manipulated through the CIA. He's a psychological operations warfare officer of the CIA. That he had been the person who had been the liaison between the CIA and the congressional committees all these years. And then at the end of his life, he is given the CIA Career Achievement Medal, which is rare. And you have to be really good at what you do to get it. And he's the person who gives it to him is Bobby Inman. Bobby Inman is so interesting on a number of levels as NSA director, deputy CIA director, Admiral Inman. In the 80s, Inman says, oh, we know all about the UFOs. We know who's inside operating them too. And he is a kind of a disclosure, CIA disclosure guy. Now he's buttoned up about it. And when they talk to him about it, no dice. He's not going to go into it. But in the late 80s, Bobby Inman was all about talking about the UFO file and ended up working at SAIC. So, that whole piece, we see a great deal of this X-Protect piece come together right there. And there's a picture, I've shown it before, it's in my documentary, of him, Joe Anides, being awarded this medal. And it is Inman, in fact, giving it to him. And there you have the crisscross of the UFO file through Inman and the secret work of Joe Anides, psychological operations, and creating the whole Oswald hoax and then protecting the assassination that the CIA X-Protect group did against Kennedy. So Morley tripped into this info and thought his Washington Post editors would be interested in it. And they said, no, we don't have any interest in it. As a matter of fact, we don't want you to talk about it. So he left and he did his own stuff. But anyway, new tapes came out about Nixon. There's still a war. There's this thing about Mar-a-Lago and the secret documents and all the rest. Well, there's still a war going on between the Nixon family and the government for his tapes. Did you know that? Interestingly enough. And so far, the government has some tapes, but they don't have all of them by a long shot. But anyway, in this one tape, he's talking with Richard Helms, who was deeply involved in the JFK assassination. So here's a little bit of their conversation that he puts in here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight on the JFK assassination. This is X Series 140, and we're taking your questions. I'm going to insert a piece in here on Jefferson, Morley, Nixon, and CIA, and then we'll get right back to them. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new here, and sign up for our newsletter. It's free. And it lets you know the exciting shows and interviews that we have coming up for you. And especially next week, we have some exciting interviews for you. And the following week, including some incredible X-Series episodes, documentaries, events coming up. You need that newsletter. Make sure you have it. It's free, and it's in your inbox every Friday. So go ahead and sign up for that. All right, Morley, are you ready? Here we go. The problem was not the CIA, Nixon said. He's talking to Helms. This is on the tape. The problem was that your plan was not carried out. It was a goddamn good plan. He's talking about the Bay of Pigs. He's trying to kiss up to him to get some information. If it had been backed up at the proper time, if he'd flown just a couple of planes over that damn place. Nixon was specific about his interest. My interest, there is not the internal situation, the fight in the CIA. After the failed invasion, the agency's leadership split over whether failure was due to an ill-conceived operation or a weak-willed president. Nixon didn't care about the blame game. Quote, my interest there is solely to know the facts. The facts of the Bay of Pigs, however, were not in dispute. The CIA-trained invasion force lost, and senior officers like Hunt were forever embittered. Nixon was finally ready to tip his hand. What I want, Dick, regarding any understanding, regarding any information. I do not want any information that comes in from you on these delicate and sensitive subjects to go anywhere outside. Especially the who shot John angle, as in who shot President Kennedy. He pressed the director for the agency's Bay of Pigs files. Nixon intuited a connection between the failed invasion in 61 and JFK's assassination 2 years later. Nixon had no desire to expose what Helms called the agency's dirty linen. Rather, he wanted to use the Bay of Pigs issue against presumed rival Ted Kennedy, supposedly. It goes a lot deeper than that. Nixon assured Helms that his concern was not the agency's actions related to Kennedy's assassination, but the criticism he faced as president. Quote from the tape now, is Eisenhower to blame? Is Johnson to blame? Is Kennedy to blame? Is Nixon to blame? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It might become, not by me, but it might become a very vigorous issue if it does. And then he goes on. Now, what's interesting is he says, speaking to his CIA director, I need to know what's necessary to protect, frankly, the intelligence gathering and the dirty tricks department. I will protect it. The president avowed, hey, listen, I have done more than my share of lying to protect you, and I believe it's totally right to do it. Helms, the CIA director, stays silent. Nixon goes on. If I don't know, then what do you have? I don't believe that you can say, well, the director of the CIA is the only one who is to know what happened in certain circumstances, Nixon said. The president is to know, and the president's successor is not to know. The agency's JFK secrets were safe with him, Nixon emphasized. I'm not going to embarrass the CIA because it served, I believe in dirty tricks. Helms finally spoke. He appeased Nixon by offering a folder of CIA cables on the assassination of DM, material that Nixon could use to impugn JFK's legacy in the 1972 election. We found out later that the cables were forged by E. Howard Hunt, and they were trying to make it appear that the Kennedys had ordered the assassination of the Vietnamese leader, the brothers DM, when in fact the CIA had taken it under their own auspices to assassinate those leaders 3 weeks before they murdered President Kennedy. And the Kennedys were freaked out because they were like, we didn't give you any authorization to set off this assassination. What are you doing? So this is the nature of the situation. But look at this conversation that's going on. Basically, Nixon is saying, I know you're responsible for the JFK assassination, and I'll protect you, but you have to kind of give me the data on which CIA agents were used, et cetera, et cetera. And then 8 months later, when the Watergate burglars were arrested, Nixon expected Helms' help because he had indeed protected Helms. But what happens is he sends people over there and he says, look, the president says, if you don't do something about getting this Watergate stuff, it's going to come back on the CIA because of the Bay of Pigs thing. And then Haldeman said, Bay of Pigs thing was our code word for the JFK assassination. So he's sitting there saying it. And they have this calm, cool, collected CIA director jump up on his desk furiously and yell, there is nothing involved with the CIA and the Bay of Pigs thing. And flipping out like that. And then later, that's the account that's given by Haldeman. And later, when it comes out that he acted up like this, Helms will say, well, look, he wanted me to change history. And I had to kind of give him a hard time, but I didn't jump up on my desk. This is the Central Intelligence Agency. They, when pressed by power, there's a lot of secrets and things that they've done. They are involved in illegal, unconstitutional activity right now as we speak. They were involved in the Ukraine situation, setting us up for World War III scenarios, all because they think through this kind of high-end gambling routine that they're doing, that they can force Russia to implode and we can, merrily move in this unipolar world. They're crazy. I can tell you that too, even with the best analysts that they have and all the rest. A lot of the ideas get very psychotic. Look at Zbigniew Brzezinski and really study some of the things that he was up to. But, and we can see it in Schwab and we can see it in the World Economic Forum people. They're surrounded by a lot of yes men who think that they can accomplish these illegal goals. So this is the nature of insanity. It's kind of like Nero in a sense, They say Nero at the end married his horse. All right, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. Gillenjoy R., how many years do we have to wait for the real truth and justice to be served up in this case? Do you believe in an ultimate justice that would eventually hold people to account? And Cold Aussie, I think an ultimate justice like that would put a lot of people off coming forward because they know that they will not be able to reveal anything because they would go to face tribunals.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's really true. Well, a lot of the people involved are dead. A lot of the people who covered it up, would have some kind of excuses like, oh, well, it was a different era, and we had to protect the American people from it. And, like Dan Rather, I love that Dan Rather's out there on Twitter being like, we need to have truth. And Elon Musk is, we can't have him take over. And, Trump should be put in jail and all this stuff. And then we know that he lied about viewing. His career got started because they said, lie about your private viewing of the Zapruder film, which no one else could see. And he said, oh, the president's head goes violently forward when it went violently backward, which, you know, the whole thing was he had to support this idea of Oswald shooting from the back. Look, the lie about Oswald is so insidious because what it does is it takes an entire apparatus and the assassination of a president who's duly elected by the American people, and it makes us into a banana republic, which is exactly what we were in that period. Now, the steps, you know, assassinating a president has to be worked out in a variety of different areas, including who's going to take over as VP, all that stuff about the cabinet and all the rest. So for the media and the government to fall down on that and to allow President Kennedy to fall into that ambush and then to cover it up is a disgrace. So here it is, you know, 59 years later, and they still won't release the records. Well, who's primarily suspected of being behind the assassination? The Central Intelligence Agency. Who won't let the records out? The Central Intelligence Agency. You know, some FBI records, I'm sure they were involved. A lot of the things that have come out about it, you know, you have to, either you're dealing with a true historical lens or we're all living in their weird fantasy. So the real historical lens is that, you know, they flouted all of the rules of the Constitution. They broke laws, and their entire organization, the Central Intelligence Agency, it's not a constitutional body. You know, it was not foreseen in the Constitution. It's extra constitutional. And it continues to grow, just like that whole apparatus. The NSA continues to grow. Homeland Security continues to grow. Now they want to add a domestic terror force through the Biden administration. And they want that, you know, for any opposition to clamp down on that. So, you know, at some point, America would just, we already resemble in large part a police state. And that trend can only get worse. What you need to do, and I think what we can do, is take the Kennedy assassination, you know, it's generational, it is legal and illegal, but it has all these aspects that we understand it as a human story, and they've covered up. So the authorities that people are supposed to trust covered up in this case. So the best thing as a country that we can do is come clean about it and the truth about what was behind it. Now, the Central Intelligence Agency was behind it, but it was a group inside of the Central Intelligence Agency that was connected with this aerospace piece. That's the X-Protect piece. That's the thing that we can bring out. And we're doing it right here in the ideas room. This is part of that echo from this incident. Yes.
Just wanted to follow up on the Maxwell Kennedy link. So Najat Madri says, Whitney Webb reported in her book that Robert Maxwell wanted Ghislaine to marry a Kennedy. I remember this.
Oh, yeah.
And Danielle Jorgen says, yes, Maxwell tried to set Ghislaine up with JFK Jr.
That's true. That's true. Yes. But I mean, a lot of people, there's a lot of targeting of JFK Jr. And, you know, it's interesting that when we got the media trying to, you know, when they did the kind of like Q thing, when they were setting up Q as a scapegoat, you know, as a straw man, and then the Q thing was part of an intel operation trying to create this idea that all conspiracies are so out there and all the rest of it. They inserted JFK Jr. Isn't that interesting? Because in fact, the thing that could be studied there with the death of JFK Jr. is who benefited, because there is another signature of a Kennedy being eliminated. And I think it's very clear from people who study the case, there's so many anomalies involved in the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. that it's very clear that that wasn't a normal plane crash. And the suspicions were, one, that he was looking into his father's death with that big magazine, George, that he had. Certainly there's actually people he was talking to along this line. And The other piece was him running for the Senate of New York in 2000, which Hillary Clinton coveted the seat because she wanted it to use as a springboard to become president, which she didn't make it, but this is what she wanted it for.
It's a pretty severe thing to do, to kill him like that. I mean, there wasn't, they could not compromise him in other ways.
He did show up at the Democratic National Convention. He was getting more in the political scene. I think they were looking at him and being like, here we go again. But I mean, the timing on that, it's just beyond. Now, I will tell you this. This is very important, and it relates to ABC News, Carolyn Kennedy, the assassination, and interviews that RFK Sr. and Jackie Kennedy gave to a journalist in 1964 and made tapes. And the journalist's name is William Manchester, and these are dramatic tapes, but they're for posterity, and they were supposed to be released in 75 years from when they were made, 1964, or 20 years after her children had passed away. This is how she laid it out. And in those tapes, what we find out is that a weird thing happened, that ABC was going to make this hit piece, JFK movie about, his philandering and all this stuff. And Carolyn Kennedy made a deal. She said, you can buy my tapes and you can let them out early, and if you won't run this stupid hit job TV series. And they said, okay, we'll do it. Now, there was a woman at the Kennedy Library who was transcribing the tapes, and she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She told someone who knew a journalist in the UK, and the Guardian published that Jackie felt and knew that LBJ was behind the assassination with the Central Intelligence Agency, and all these things came out about these tapes. When ABC got the tapes, none of that stuff was in there. It was all like, how did you like life in the White House and all this kind of stuff. So the woman, obviously they got rid of the woman who was doing the transcribing. She had leaked it. And so what we have in those tapes is a very unusual situation. Now, if you look into the history of the Kennedy Library, two weird things have happened in relation to it. One, the Carlyle Group invested a large share to take over. The Carlyle Group associated mostly with the Bushes and others. That's a weird, makes strange bedfellows, shall we say. And I like the Kennedy Library. I think they have amazing things there. And the most glaring piece there that I think is important, besides the incredible history of the Kennedy presidency, is all the Ernest Hemingway. They have the largest depository of Ernest Hemingway documents. And I've pointed this out before. Now, here's the other weird thing that happened. On the day of the Boston Marathon, the Kennedy Library had a fire, and it was a huge fire. As a matter of fact, it was reported as an explosion, and it happened at the same time that this was taking place. So reporters went out there, and I still remember watching the local news reports, and they go up to the woman who's coming out the door, and they say, what happened? Is everybody safe? And she goes, oh, no, it was nothing. It was just a small fire and it's all set. And then they pan the camera out, and there's this huge black plume of smoke coming out of the library. And all the original reports, and you can still find some of them online, some of them have been removed, all have this original explosion at the Kennedy Library during the Boston Marathon explosions. So it's been said before that somebody wanted those recordings before all this other stuff happened. And, so again, we're kind of in that stealth archives realm, but these things get out, and I think that was a really kind of, speaking of the stealth archives, that's a really excellent example. Yes.
Joseph Farrell. Trump's friendship with JFK Jr. is also a factor.
Excellent
and there
point.
are other in caps connections between Trump and Kennedy.
Oh, yes. Excellent point. Well, I think what we can see very clearly is that in the beginning of his administration, RFK Jr. was going to come in and do a vaccine commission. And then Bill Gates got in there and said, you can't use him. So that shows us that power struggle on that level. And RFK Jr., when he came on this program, he said, the overwhelming problem is that when you look at like Anderson Cooper, he's sponsored, and it's not just his show that is sponsored, but he as a newscaster is sponsored by Pfizer. So this is a problem, because people think, oh, I'm getting the real thing. The average person is like, Anderson Cooper is going to give me a real story. I mean, you're sponsored by Pfizer. You're not going to say anything bad against Pfizer. That's the way it goes. And, I think that the level of this is not understood, just how insidious that money works, and that we need a whole new system of journalism to take that whole thing apart, basically. And we see glimmers of it here and there, but there's no question that Trump, especially being aware of what was in the CIA records around the JFK assassination, and then when you really look at this idea of this president coming into power, what is it that Trump and JFK had in common? Well, JFK understood the UFO file, as we've laid out here tonight, when he got in. And it is Trump, and he's also a self-made man. He has his own money. You're not able to manipulate him that way. So that's a problem for the CIA and for the X-Protect apparatus. Much harder to manipulate than Nixon or somebody like that. Then you get Trump, who goes in. He knows about the UFO file through his uncle. His uncle worked with the person in charge of it. This has got to be just, a line in the sand, a flag on the spot, because John Trump and his connection with the UFO file transferring down changes the story from loudmouth real estate mogul happens to get into the presidency to billionaire, UFO file and inheritor goes in and faces off against the other apparatus, because they're worried about him because he's on the same level of knowledge that they're on. You don't have to like Trump necessarily. Some people love him, some people hate him, but you have to understand the connections that Trump has in relation to the UFO piece. And there's no better place to look for it than Roy Cohn. Because,
okay, that was my next question.
Yes. Okay, what do you got?
Karen Carpenter, was Ray Cohn, the original swamp creature, involved?
Roy Cohn was the original swamp creature. Here's the thing that you have to understand about Roy Cohn. He knows where the bodies are buried in relation to the deep state. He, with Joseph McCarthy, is going into what? In 1952, 1953? Project Blue Book. He's figuring out that the Army is working with this. And if you look at some of the things that are in Joseph's book on McCarthy, it's quite fascinating, because he is hammering these people getting answers. And they're talking, they're opening up, and they're giving him those facts. If you look at him and you follow his trajectory, who else was associated with McCarthy? The Kennedys were. So Cohn is plugged right in right at the very beginning. But then, he works for the Bronfmans. So that whole piece of the deep state, he runs Trump through the New York apparatus to build Trump Tower. He has his political mentor. He understands that whole realm. And I think when you look at him, you also have to go back to DISC, which is the Defense Industrial Security Command, that comes up in the Torbett document, which Torbett is like a 1970 WikiLeaks. And it's a huge download of information relating to the Garrison trial and the aerospace aspect that's involved, and the FBI's Division 5, and this DISC group, which is headed up by Werner von Braun, which is basically a NASA security force deep inside the government. And the agents of DISC are borrowed from the CIA, and they are Clay Shaw, all the people involved in what we see in the Garrison case in New Orleans. So the Defense Industrial Security Command is where Oswald comes out of. That's also where Bannister comes out of. That's why Oswald gets a job with Bannister, because DISC is moving this around. The only problem is there's no official document, in the time that Torbett puts it out that says anything about DISC. People will find later references to DISC, and they'll find it in Ohio, of all places. Well, Wright-Patterson's in Ohio. DISC is the great question mark in all this, but Cone is listed in the Torbett document. There's a great deal of information about Cone in there. So we're already looking. Cone is around exotic technology early, but he's also around the McCarthy hearings. He's also around these mafia legal cases. So that is, this is somebody who ends up like with all these photo ops at Studio 54 and all the rest. But, he's someone that you can track a great deal and connect a great deal of the dots on the deep state through. But if he is transferring that to Trump, when Trump gets in, the whole system shakes because they're worried. Well, he knows, he knows the UFO file and he knows this other system. What are we going to do with this guy? Get him out any way you can. And that's what they did. They did it to a point of making themselves look ridiculous to even normal people. And they propagandized the rest, right? So if you even say Trump, you're a fascist or whatever, if you live in liberal Cambridge, as I do. And yet the truth is that, in the period that Trump is in office, the deep state and the CIA apparatus is so heavily opposed to him, it has to raise the question, why? And, just as when Kennedy gets in, there's a constant, they're trying to get him involved in Bay of Pigs. They're trying to ruin his image. They're trying to do these things. It's because when they get someone who's from outside their system, I can't really say Trump is outside their system, but he's from a different slice of their system. It's just competition, and you look at one part trying to take out the other one. That's what we see so much of it there. Miss Olivia, 2 more questions.
Okay, Syrianification. Right after the JFK assassination, CIA Operation Mockingbird went into effect.
Yes.
The term, quote, conspiracy theory was coined in media news at the time to use against any opposition/alternatives to who killed JFK.
Yeah, well, the Central Intelligence Agency created the term conspiracy theory. They were like, this is a good thing that we can hang. Call them a conspiracy theorist if they raise any questions in relation to it. So Professor Scott talks about getting that document, and it's so in black and white there about what they're up to. So we know they're propagandizing. Well, they've grown so much since the 1960s. When I look at the group that Kennedy is fighting in his presidency, and I think that Frankenstein has grown so much in 59 years that when I see them trot out people, on the CIA side saying, oh, there's a UFO threat and we need to be careful and take on that government to make sure they tell us the truth. I worry about people's sensibilities in relation to it and if they know just how dangerous the Central Intelligence Agency is, and that their career, is lying, and that the people that they put out for counterintelligence, the Elizondos and those people, they're trained, they're professional liars. And that has to be, we deal a lot in the UFO file piece. Those UFO people, thinking that they're going to get some kind of a shout out from, the CIA UFO group. It's so backward a thing. You're never going to get any truth or transparency from the Central Intelligence Agency. It's not in their best interest to give you anything. So we all should be very clear on that. I think on the research side, Who on earth would think you're going to get the truth from the CIA or the NSA or any of those? I mean, it's not going to happen. Government's tough enough, right? You're not going to get any truth from them. They're intel agencies. You know, we're talking about them in the legit way. If you go even 1 inch deep, watch out, you know. So let's get real about that. And I think it's a very clear rule to make, which is people who work for the Central Intelligence Agency, you just don't work with them when it comes to UFO research. That's a pretty straight ahead rule. I think that would work. Yes.
Okay. Final question.
Yes.
Okay. Devlin Liam McGregor. Who shot JFK is totally irrelevant. Why is it covered up today? The black budget.
Well, yeah, think about the black budget this way, which is they have this incredible apparatus for secret finance, and they've built it up over years through different things. There's a wonderful book that Dr. Farrell did, which talks about Yamashita's Gold, I think is what it's called. And that's the name of the story in it. I think it's the, if Joseph is out there, he can help me with the title of the book. I think it's the Secret Space Program book. But anyway, it's fascinating because it shows that when they find all this gold by torturing the emperor's driver, then they create a whole system that, you know, Japan has been hoarding all this gold, and then they keep it off the record, and they use it for all these black ops. So there's a series of different things like that. That's the true black budget, in my opinion. The black budget came out in an article during the Reagan years in 1986 in a Michigan newspaper, and they started to figure out the expenditures thing. Now there's something in the government called FASB 56, which Catherine Fitz reports on, that basically blows away any transparency in government, especially around the defense aspects. So that black budget is operating and creating more, you know, there's more of a black hole with those trillions going out the back door than we've ever seen before. Yes.
Joseph says, and it was Ed Lansdale who did the torturing.
Oh, that's right. Oh my God. You know, Joseph, we should do a show on Lansdale, and I would love to go into that Yamashita's story. So I know we have a show coming up, but that's going to be part of it. I'm sure. I was always blown away by that piece and all the ripples. And I actually think the Pelosi piece that Farrell, you know, Joseph raised it in our last interview. We did a show on money, actually. It wasn't the last one. It was the second to last, I think. And there was a whole thing about Nancy going over to Taiwan and the bonds that are associated over there. That is fascinating. Go back and check that episode out, and we'll revisit that next week with Joseph Farrell for sure. Amazing show tonight. Unbelievable questions with the ideas room. Just incredible being here with you, Miss Olivia. Fantastic. Your last question. Go for it.
Oh, that was the last question.
Oh, okay. You got it?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to throw a couple of things in. I love this. Kennedy, when Dulles, the CIA director, tries to fake him into invading Cuba because there's no choice, Kennedy says no. And then afterwards he says, you know, I'm going to tell you something. And this is a picture of them after he gives them the speech. But he says, if this was England, I would have to go. But this is America, and you have to go. And Dulles couldn't believe it, because Dulles basically built the CIA, and he'd been in there as director for 11 years. So here's Kennedy saying, you're on your way out. And he did, in fact, fire him, which, you know, certainly contributed to his own problems, but was an incredibly brave thing to do. That's what you have to do. Bring it to bear and be brave in the moment. And they say that actually Dulles never relinquished intelligence control, and that he remained, even though we had these other CIA directors. But I think that sense of Kennedy overcoming. And, you know, some of these pictures Kennedy with LBJ and Court Davis. That's another feral one. You know, Davis basically becoming NASA's point man for the UFO file. The whole scene there laid out so well. And again, part of that apparatus brought over from Germany, an incredible program. But interestingly enough, if I recall correctly, he's involved. He's more of the Bell project kind of scientific background. So why he would be at NASA, very, very interesting indeed. The only other thing I wanted to mention in relation to this was someone who I've known people who knew her. I think she's passed away now, but her name was Marita Lorenz, and the CIA used her because she was Castro's girlfriend for a while, and they wanted to set up this scenario. But she went out with Frank Sturgis, and Sturgis was one of those people involved in the Cuba situation, black operator here, and then caught as one of the Watergate people with Hunt, which is how we even know who they are. You know, that's the thing. The Watergate burglary is the only reason we even know their names. Remember that. But Lorenz went on the record with something very interesting. One, that Oswald was part of a team, Operation 40, which was to try to liberate Cuba from Castro. So he was not pro-Castro at all, and that he was one of the people that we had trained as part of this group. And so he was, you know, on the military CIA side. That's one thing she put on the record. The other thing she put on the record was that E. Howard Hunt was the paymaster for the JFK assassination, and that she was driving with the group that was, you know, basically one of the teams that they were assembling for this. And Frank Fiorini was his real name, of course. And he basically, you know, told her, we're going to be doing this. And they met up with Hunt. And when she saw that Hunt was there and that he was the paymaster and he was paying them, she got out of there. And she wouldn't have any part of it. But she was young. She was, I think, maybe 19 years old, and the CIA was using her in these things. But I think her testimony, and then the piece where we tie Hunt in with Caddy talking about Kennedy being eliminated over the UFO file, we can think of those things in relation to each other. Hunt was certainly deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination, and the reason being that the X-Protect group, that small group in the CIA working in that corridor of defense contracting around aerospace. Remember, this is the conclusion that Jim Garrison came to, which was the aerospace corridor, the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex that did the assassination. Interesting point here, which is the CIA records, the ones that they're keeping, are related directly to the Garrison investigation. Whatever it is that Garrison ran into, they don't want to deal with or have public. That's part of it. So let's keep that in mind. Part of the records that will never be released are the employment records of Jack Ruby, including his tax returns, and the employment records of Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, who did they work for? They worked for DISC. You don't want to slip their tax returns out. So when we think about it that way, then this is an inside job, but the group that was committing it was directly related to the aerospace UFO file piece. That's the part that is not covered sufficiently either on the UFO side or on the deep state side. If you want the answers on the Kennedy assassination, you have to go to the UFO file. There's no question about it. And with that, Miss Olivia,
there was a book you were going to share?
Yes.
You want to show some of the books that you used for this episode?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's so many. That's Garrison's book, On the Trail of the Assassins. Everything's in there. In fact,
Garrison was a genius.
Garrison was a genius. He also found himself directly facing off against this thing. You know, he thinks, oh, I'm going to investigate the Kennedy assassination. And then suddenly, you know, he's dealing with all these aerospace people. He's like, what's going on here? And Nazis. This NASA Nazis and JFK, Ken Thomas, that's the Torbett document. It's his repackaged version. Ken Thomas, I think his original research stands up very, very well. And I think it's often, you know, I see a lot of different authors incorporate Thomas's stuff, and I feel like Thomas should get maybe a little more credit. But certainly he's done some excellent work. Family of Secrets, that's Russ Baker before he went all COVID crazy. And what else we got here? Oh, this is interesting. Save the best for last, right? This is Let Justice Be Done, the William Davey book. There's something very interesting in here that really kind of blows me away. The Bannister Files, okay? Now, this guy's not interested in the UFO file or anything. It's just a straight up piece about the Garrison trial and the legal machinations and the CIA and all that. Okay. The Bannister Files. Facing financial difficulties, Bannister's widow, Mary, sold many of her husband's files to Aaron Cohn's Metropolitan Crime Commission. Other files sent to the State Sovereignty Commission and the State Police, along with a complete index card catalog. Garrison's attempts to retrieve the files were unsuccessful. However, Garrison was able to obtain a list of the index cards from the State Police. Unfortunately, the set was incomplete because the receptionist had used the backs of the cards to record phone messages for the police officers. However, the remaining cards did offer an inside peek into the Bannister apparatus. Using an FBI-like classification system, some of Bannister's files were as follows. I'm only going to read the important ones. The Central Intelligence Agency. Assassination of President Kennedy. Lloyd J. Cobb. But here's the kicker. Inside CIA, here's the kicker. Dinosaur Space Warcraft. The Dinosaur program, which was the program where they eliminated the Blue Gemini program by threatening NASA to turn it over to the military. This was Kennedy making sure there was no secret space program. But what was Dinosaur? Interestingly enough, it lands in the middle here, and it's traditionally called, Dinosaur is the next step in exploring space and all the rest of it. Here, what is it that Bannister is calling Dinosaur? Dinosaur Space Warcraft. So it is a warcraft basically built for space. This is what we're talking about. That's in Guy Bannister's piece. So, Mr. UFO File, X-File, Bannister, who's hiring Lee Harvey Oswald to, invade student groups and pretend he's a Cuban and pretending he's a leftist, he is here and has a folder on Dinosaur Space Warcraft, meaning the war aspects related to the UFO file directly. That's what those crafts were about. Remember, one of the things that Corso put on the record is, what did Dornberger build the X-15 for? Was it just to be a fast space plane? No, it was to actually track UFOs. So they wanted somebody in there manned, going as fast as they possibly could, chasing UFOs. That's what the X-15 was built for. This is the hidden history, the piece that's just hanging out there. And I think the closer we get to that, the better off we are. And, so the idea that the mafia, killed JFK or whatever, it's very low level, the mafia piece on this. Absolutely. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, I have a bunch of super chatters to thank.
Excellent.
Gil and Joy R, Undestroyer, Brian Storm, Redcap Goblin, Mark Petrie, Neil Hart, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Matthew Goodpaster, Jordan Banner, Erica Swenson Elliott, Dorian Hewitt, Eurythmia's Fun, Jim Sarge 3ID, Harbardian, James Cregan, Bob Bennett, CT, Robert Scott, Luke Walker, Red Magnetic Dragon, Cursicella, Johnny Ricardo Bown, Globe Atlantis, and Jennifer Walters. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We appreciate your support, and it helps to keep us going, and it makes all the difference for the reports we do and to all our subscribers. and supporters. We really appreciate it. We couldn't do what we do without you. We'll be back with you on Tuesday for the Kennedy anniversary. I'm going to play some of the documentaries and commentary and other things. And we'll probably start that maybe like around 7 on Tuesday night. And I know it's going into Thanksgiving week. I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving. And we're going to be looking maybe at some special reports coming up as well. We have Catherine Fitz coming up. We have Joseph Farrell coming up, Gigi Young. It's going to be an incredible end of November into December, and then some surprise guests as well. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here while I am here. The Black Zionist is out there. Tina Boric, Jennifer Walters, Ideas Room. Good night, Ideas Room. There we go. Finding People. Finding Peyote. Peyote. All right. I was just reading about Aldous Huxley and peyote. You're going to have to educate me on that one. Been reading a lot of Aldous Huxley lately. Fantastic, everyone. Brian D. Michael Golpe. Thank you, sir. It's great to see you. Najat. Very nice to see you out there. Traveling Riverside Blues. Oh, hey, I found out it's Carly's birthday.
Oh,
happy birthday, Carly. Wherever you are in the UK, having a good time. Joseph, it's great to see you, sir. Yes, I will. I'll check those messages. No doubt about it. Modwiz, great to see you. Diana. Hey. Buddha Yogi. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Jason May. Always the best. Thank you. Johnny Ricardo. Hey, thanks for pronouncing my last name right for once. Yes, now we're talking. Love Friday nights. Yes, Friday is where it's at, and we know it. That's why we always have the best time with you and the ideas from here. Greatest intel on the interwebs. Exactly. Thank you, Danielle. Really appreciate that. Love you too. Thank you. Fantastic. Oh, it's great to see everyone here. Thanks a million to all. Fantastic show. Be safe, be well, says Max Little. Fantastic. Great group tonight, and able-bodied. It's great to see you out there. Excellent questions. Whew. Wow. What a great crew. I learn a lot from the ideas room. Let me tell you, you guys are outstanding. All right. Dinosaur. Let me tell you, there's a lot in that dinosaur story. There's no question about it. And the name's a dead giveaway. Love DJ's Gurdjieff Ouspensky knowledge. Well, look, I could do shows on that. I would keep you here for hours doing shows on Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. I have a lot of new stuff to read all about them. So that's going to be an ongoing feature for everything we do, because it's so important, I think. And maybe there's some surprises coming in there as well.
Can I throw you a last minute question?
Thanks you for fielding my Kennedy UFO question, Daniel. Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Cursicella. What's your take on J.D. Tippit, the police officer who was killed in Dallas and looked very similar to JFK? There were rumors their bodies were switched, something along those lines. And Dimensional Gateway, J.D. Tippit's nickname was JFK in the police force.
Isn't that interesting? Tippit is interesting. He's like a sacrifice in the whole thing, but it's also to pretend. Remember, this is what they hold Oswald for. So it's the toehold to hold him before he actually can be accused of anything. They don't accuse him of shooting the president till much later in the day. They grab him for killing Tippit. And, if you go back and look at those descriptions, the person who shot Tippit was overweight and short. So, Oswald, for some reason, by the time of the assassination, was thin and gangly. And he probably was stressed out from all his CIA handler work and activity. You can only imagine. But there's a strange thing about the entire police aspect of the JFK assassination. And there's deep knowledge in that police force of what was going on. And the person that I pointed out earlier Roscoe White was part of that, you know, and again, the badge man thing.
Oh, I'm
I
glad
mean,
you brought that up.
we have something kind of important there. Yeah.
So Roscoe White, why would he have kept those documents? I mean, was this like a dead man switch?
I don't know. You know, there's a lot of funny business around Roscoe White, but the fact that the document was there in the picture, you know, how they framed Oswald, and that the photo experts pointed out that Roscoe White was the one that they used. This was maybe his introduction to setting up Oswald, but if you knew him, it would have been a lot easier. And so he knew him in the Marine Corps. So I think the Roscoe White and the Ricky White diary is something to consider out there. I do think that it was bungled, and I think the FBI also interfered with whatever was going on there. But certainly Roscoe White was involved on some level. And there was that national security threat suggestion again, which is the same thing that comes around later when Caddy is talking to his friend E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt says, Kennedy was about to give our most vital national security secret to the Russians. And Caddy said, what's the secret? And he said, the UFO file, the alien presence. That's, you know, this is how they built their case with their own people, saying, well, we can take him out because he's a threat. And so who is he a threat to? That apparatus that was dealing with the exotic technology at NASA. That's the X-Protect connect with the Intel piece. I think we can get it, and it really, through this work, I think we are. But Tippett, yeah, a very interesting story.
One more thing. So Wally Tango Foxtrot, the premise for the cop killing was so that he could be killed while being arrested. He knew that, hence the public movie theater buffer to avoid being killed. I remember when you talked to Jim Mars, there was a crazy story that never surfaces anywhere else about some other
It's just like you to
going
hit
on.
me with that one at the very end of the show. It was about, no, I think I did it, about two people being
You
taken
did?
out. Yes,
Okay,
I
all
did
right.
actually. Thank God.
Okay.
Right? You're right. Jim Mars.
Where
always
is
had,
that? Is that still on YouTube?
it is actually the Dark Journalist Jim Mars interview from 2014.
Wow.
Which is a classic legend, is way back there. And man, if you want to talk to somebody about the JFK assassination, Jim Mars, late Jim Mars, was crucial. You know, it's amazing we have incredible people working now into later years, like Professor Peter Del Scott is in his 90s and still doing this work around the deep state. Thank God we have him, because he's still, you know, he can whip out that information like no one. Good night. Great show. Wow. Fantastic. So fantastic. Miss Olivia, nicely done.
Thank you.
Way to go.
They're making me hungry in the chat. They're talking about donuts. I'm dying.
Careful. She likes cider donuts, as we know.
I like lemon donuts too.
Lemon donuts.
Mhm.
Dutch Sense. Someone mentioned Dutch. I have not heard of Dutch Sense in a while. I remember Dutch Sense from way back, and the whole like earthquake and all that stuff. So he's still out there rocking it. That's good to know. Longest show ever tonight. Woo! I think you're right. We did it. Well, you get into Kennedy territory, you're going to do it. We'll see you all next week. And you know, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends. Am I right, or am I right?
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
It's great to see everyone, and never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and it just might be again. We'll see you soon.
Okay. God bless.